I declare that we are in the committee of the whole for the purposes of conducting our workshop. Without objection, so moved. Before we move into the agenda, I do want to welcome all who are joining us today, and I want to give a special warm welcome to our newest board member, Mr. Jordan Mullenhour, who is representing the 2nd Congressional District. He's replacing Mr. Mike Edwards on the board, who you all know has served on this board for 10 years. We're going to take a moment. Vice Chair Evie and myself and Mr. Mullenhour, we're going to move to the front of the room, and we are going to officially welcome him as a board member by bestowing to him the Tennessee State Board of Education pen. So we'll move to the front for a moment. I also want to thank the Tennessee Board of Regents for the usage of their facility, which is available to us until 4 p.m. today. And with that being said, I do want to point out that if for any reason we are running overtime with each topic and we still have questions that are being asked by board members, we want you to ask those questions. But we will record those questions if we run out of time to be able to answer all of them. So I want to just make sure that you are aware of that and you have our complete appreciation for helping us to stay on track. Each presenter, I'm not asking you to speed up. I don't want you to do that at all because I think we will be in good shape and be able to leave here by 4 p.m. today to honor the TBR's request. So let's move into our presentations, and as always, yes, thank you. I was just reminded, in case you all are not aware of the fact that Dr. Sarah Morrison, the Executive Director for the Tennessee State Board of Education, is not with us here today. I think most of you know that she is out on leave because she just gave birth to a baby girl, Virginia Townley Morrison. So we do have sitting in for her Dr. Amy Owen, who is here today, and we are thankful for her sitting in for Dr. Morrison. Thank you for the reminder. So a few reminders to the presenters. As always, please state your name and title for the record. So let's move into the first presentation, Statewide Dual Credit, Zachary Adams with the Tennessee Board of Regents.
Good afternoon. My name is Zachary Adams. I'm the Director of Post-Secondary Coordination and Alignment at the Tennessee Board of Regents. Just use the space bar. For the board, I manage and lead a suite of K-12 initiatives for the system. And so today we'll be focusing specifically on the statewide dual credit program area. And as you'll see throughout the presentation today, that the redesign work that we've been undergoing with this program area specifically really align with the board's strategic priorities around open access and completion. So today, my primary goal is to give you an overview of the statewide dual credit program, present to you some historic trends in terms of participation in the program, as well as student success as measured by those high school students who are earning college credit. I also want to summarize for you what we've been doing over the last several years to make to provide better curriculum supports to both teachers and students in the high school space, and preview for you some preliminary data from this past fall that seems to be very promising in terms of how we're supporting teachers and students in these courses. And then there will be plenty of time to ask your questions. If you do have questions or you want me to clarify something, please feel free to interrupt, and I will clarify whatever's on the slide at that moment. So briefly, what is statewide dual credit? These are legislatively mandated opportunities. There's an entire chapter in code dedicated to them. They are unique early post-secondary opportunities because they are developed by college faculty from across the state, but they're taught by high school teachers. And so it's a very popular option, particularly for smaller rural systems, because they don't have to worry about finding an instructor who meets the college level academic requirements to teach a dual enrollment course. What also makes these courses unique is that students have to sit for a challenge exam at the end of the course, and if they pass that exam, credit is mandated to articulate to all of Tennessee's public colleges and universities. Each college, through their governing board, is able to decide how that credit articulates, if it'll articulate for a particular major requirement or if it will articulate for elective credit, but the credit has to be placed on the college transcript. Here's a listing of the current courses that we offer. I do want to point out that we are really thrilled to be able to offer 2 new CTE dual credit courses next year, Introduction to Marketing and Introduction to Education. Those courses are being developed as we speak, and the feedback that we've gotten from districts is that they're really excited, particularly about the education course, to be able to offer that to students.
Mr. Eby?
Thank you. How do you decide what courses to offer? I mean,
Yeah.
these are great, but there's so many others. How do
Yes.
you decide?
Yeah, that's a great question. So all of these courses are prioritized through a couple of different factors. The main one being that these courses align to Tennessee transfer pathways. And so regardless of whether a student is going to a community college or to a four-year institution, these courses align with courses in those transfer pathways so that we're ensuring that this credit is truly helping students accelerate their time for college degree completion. I will say a note about the marketing and the education courses. We also received some feedback from the State Department of Education that those CTE programs of study specifically didn't have as many early post-secondary opportunities, and so we wanted to flesh out those programs of study and ensure that those students had content-specific college courses that they could take as a part of those CTE programs of study. So I'm going to move into some data. And this first graph is showing you enrollment over time. And so the statewide dual credit program launched in the 13-14 school year, serving about 3,000 students. And these enrollment trends are noted with the red line. As you can see, the popularity of this program has grown over time. Last year, we served just under 40,000 students. It's an incredibly popular opportunity for high schools. What I do want to point out is, and this is represented by the blue bar, is the pass rate on these challenge exams. You can see that even though we've seen tremendous growth in students taking these courses, over time, the pass rate and therefore students' ability to earn college credit has maintained kind of persistently low. And that's not what we want to see. We want students not only gaining exposure to rigorous coursework, but also banking college credit. And so later on in the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing to better support teachers and students in these courses. Just to tease out a little bit about, a little bit more around student success in these courses, this bar chart represents the median score on every single challenge exam. And so you can see that students aren't scoring very high on these exams. They are aligned to college level courses. These are very rigorous courses and exams. And so the goal, the definition of success isn't necessarily 100% pass rate, but again, just another way of looking at the data to understand that there is work to do to better support teachers and students.
One quick question, just on, does some of these have overlap with AP courses?
Yes.
And some AP
Microphone.
courses designed by College Board with, oh, sorry. Did I push anything?
So, excuse me. So I was just curious, have we looked at the data where there's overlapping courses with AP? So the College Board's building out courses that says, hey, college credit. These are also college credit, and where there's classes like psychology or statistics or American history or U.S. history, are we seeing any correlations between pass rates within schools or districts that you see in the same trends with AP and this, or different?
We haven't looked into that specifically. It's something that I definitely will make a note to do.
Okay.
We have had some sort of informal conversations with the academics team at the Department of Education, and some of the pass rates that we see, particularly for the pre-calculus course and the statistics course, do mirror students who are scoring on track or mastered on the state assessment. So there is some similarity in sort of the preparedness and therefore the pass rate with those math courses. But overall, the pass rates are a little lower than where we would want them to be.
Okay.
Just before you go on, clarification. So when I look at the median score, is that the percentage of pass rates, or is that a score like a cut score?
Right. So this median score represents, it's a measure of central tendency that represents all of the students across the state. So for instance, with the business course, the score for all students across the state is a 55%, so an F.
So what do you have to get credit?
It varies by course. Mm-hmm. The faculty teams are deciding what the cut score will be. For most courses, it's a 70%. There is one course, the American History course, where it's a 75%. And then the new education course, what's being proposed, is an 80%. And that's because there are four-year institutions in the state that will only accept the education course if a student earns a B. And so we didn't want students to take the dual credit course.
So again, trying to, pardon me.
Yeah, no, you're fine.
So 80%, is that equivalent to an 80 on your bar chart there, or is it 80% of the 55 get credit?
So the bar chart is a percent, like a grade on the exam.
Okay.
So across the board, we're not seeing any grades higher than an F in terms of the average score. But the cut score to pass is a 70. So
So the average more than the average is below what it takes to get credit.
right for
you.
students.
Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Adams, as a point of clarification, do all students who take these courses have to take this exam, or is there a self-selection bias concern here?
No, all students who are enrolled in statewide dual credit courses must sit for the challenge exam.
Is there anything in the data that would suggest that some people simply don't care about the results of the test? They're just being forced to take it. They don't care to get the college transfer benefits, and therefore they just don't care at all, and that's what's showing up in the data here. Do you find there's an inverted bell curve of some sort?
Anecdotally, every district has different rules for how they're placing students into these courses. For instance, with the World History course, there is a trend among districts that they put all ninth graders into that course. And so it varies from district to district. So when a district is deciding that we're going to replace our ninth grade world history course with the SDC course for all of our ninth graders, there are some concerns with the readiness of all of those ninth graders taking that college level course, and I think that is reflected a little bit in the data.
Zachary, quick point of clarification for our members. In order to earn additional weights on your GPA for taking a course like statewide dual credit, you do have to sit for the challenge exam. And that's true for AP and IB as well. So if you took an AP course and you didn't take the exam at the end, you would simply have your regular GPA. You wouldn't have the additional bonus points under the uniform grading policy.
So one more slide here of data before we talk about what we're doing to improve student success. What you see here is the pass rate for each course since the school year that it was introduced. The green highlight is the year with the highest pass rate, and the red highlight represents where the course had the lowest pass rate. I do want to point out, for the 1920 school year, we canceled spring testing because schools closed, and so the 1920 school year represents December test takers, and then an optional test window that we had, so students were self-selecting into that. So that was most likely students who felt prepared, were motivated to come back in the fall of 2020 to sit for the exam, and that's why we see those higher pass rates during the 1920 school year. But as you can see, in some courses, particularly courses like world history, we see that very persistently low pass rate. As I mentioned, for world history, one of the primary drivers of that low pass rate is that districts are replacing their regular high school world history course with this SDC course. And so we are doing work to try and highlight best practices from districts on how to better place students. And I'll move into this in just a minute, but we've also asked faculty to provide prerequisites for some of these courses so that it encourages better placement into some of these courses. Because the last thing we want is for students to have a really negative experience with a college level course. We obviously want as many students as possible to be exposed to this level of rigor and earn college credit, especially because this opportunity is completely free for students. They're not paying anything for this course or the exam. But we don't want them to be so defeated when they first take this opportunity. So 2 slides on some bright spots. So overall, the pass rate across all courses last year was 6.3% of students. So that is very low, but that represents over a $2 million savings to Tennessee families with that pass rate. And so currently that represents over a 50% return on investment for what the state pays for this program. So this return on investment will only continue to grow as I preview some of the promising data we've seen in terms of student success. But I wanted to highlight that number for you. And while we do see low pass rates in many of these courses, there are a lot of districts who are having tremendous success with statewide dual credit. So I wanted to highlight a few of those for you today. What I will say about this list here is that we suppressed any school district or classroom that had fewer than 25 students. So there are other individual teachers and school systems that had even higher pass rates than what are represented on the screen, but we suppressed that data because we didn't want the class size was so small. So I'm going to move into what we have been doing over the last couple of years to address these low pass rates. The courses on the left-hand side of the screen, so pre-calculus through sociology, went through a redesign process last year. And so these redesigned courses are being implemented right now during this school year. And the courses on the right side of the screen, agriculture, business through introduction to marketing, are being redesigned as we speak for implementation next school year. So these courses I've mentioned are developed by college faculty. We put an open call to all institutions across the state, public, private, 2-year, 4-year, to develop a really diverse team, to create a diverse team to develop these courses. And so there were several areas that we honed in on that we felt were just sort of foundational curriculum guardrails for teachers and students to be successful in these courses. The first was, prior to this school year, there was not a foundational textbook for any of these courses. And so some school systems who had the funds available were purchasing a college level text. Other school systems were using a high school textbook that they had on hand. And so there was a level of an uneven level of just access to the right curriculum resources. So the first thing that we've asked faculty to do is to select one primary text for the course and to revise the learning objectives and the challenge exam to be aligned to that textbook. So if there's a concept that's covered in the business course, it should show up in the learning objectives and the challenge exam in the same way that it is covered in that textbook. The other really exciting thing, and Tennessee is the first state to do this statewide, is that these textbooks are open access, meaning that they're completely free to use. They can be downloaded and printed without any fear of copyright use violation. That is particularly meaningful for students who may not have stable internet access at home or any internet access at home. Their teacher can print them a copy of this book and they can use it at home. And so leveling the playing field in terms of access to the right curriculum materials was incredibly important for us. We also, for the first time for all of our courses, created test blueprints. And so we wanted teachers to know how much of each topic area was going to be covered on the challenge exam. And we created pacing guides for them as well. So if 20% of topic A is going to be on the challenge exam, roughly 20% of their time spent in the classroom should be covering topic A. And so those are the foundational curriculum guardrails that we provided to teachers. And we've seen some really great early success with these courses. Any questions here on that redesign process?
A quick question here. So in terms of the open textbook stuff, do, let's say Kingsport here, for example, did they have access to those textbooks that, let's say, somewhere else had a much lower success rate, by chance?
Prior to this school year or this school year? So
I mean, just in general, so let's say for sociology for Kingsport, did they have access to those textbooks compared to areas that scored lower that didn't have access to them? Is there a correlation there?
Yeah, there could have been, for sure. We know that some districts were able to purchase additional curriculum resources. Some teachers, prior to having these foundational curriculum resources, just kind of cracked the code to be able to help their students do better on these exams. And so through this redesign work, we're trying to provide all teachers with the same level of support as they prepare their curriculum for these courses. So here are some early indications of success from this past fall. So I mentioned that we offer testing in December and May, so we've got some early results. In 4 of the 6 courses that were redesigned, the number of students earning credit increased. The median score across 5 of the 6 courses increased. That means that even if the pass rate didn't increase, students are scoring higher, so that's demonstrating to us that they are mastering more of the material because they have that textbook, because the teachers have access to the pacing guide. And then for several of our courses, and this is just within a 6-month period, so these are very, very early results, so I'm very excited about what we're seeing, even though it's not across all 6 courses yet. The business course, the pass rate rose from 1.5%, which represents less than 10 students in the state, to 23.7% in 1 semester. So that teachers, and I think we all can agree, when teachers are given the access to the right curriculum materials, they're going to be able to apply their expertise and run with it and prepare students to be successful.
Mr. Adams, can you clarify?
Yes, sir.
The sample size, you said fewer than 10 students across the state represent the 1.5% metric. How many students represent the 23.7% metric?
The business course usually has enrollment, and I'll get the specific, but it's anywhere from 300 to 800 students across the state total are taking that course. So prior to this fall, only roughly 1% of those students were passing the exam. And we've seen that jump to 23%. And then in the sociology and pre-calculus courses, we saw the pass rate rise by 10%. So some really great early data around how this work is supporting teachers and students. Any final questions for me before I turn it over to the next presenter?
I'll be pretty brief with this one here. So do you think, for example, that maybe, of course, teachers having access to textbooks and better, coaching materials would be useful? Do you think on the student end that maybe they need some more teaching on how to study better? I know for at least my first year in college or first semester in college, and trying to learn how to study has been a big change for me. So I think, do you think that pass rate would increase if we had, materials for students to learn how to study better, for example?
Yeah, and that is, so we don't provide anything directly for students, but as a part of the teacher training process, there is a whole module on what is the difference between an OER, an open access text, and a text you would buy from a publisher. So those teachers are sort of, we're trying to help them be more comfortable with, you can download this, you can print it, you can use it online and offline. And then we all, as a part of that module, are saying, here are some ways that our college faculty use these textbooks in their own classes and develop assignments so that it becomes so that using the text becomes a part of the student's routine in the course.
So is there direct professional development that is provided, or how are you interacting with the teachers to provide this development or this assistance in making the strides, the improvements?
Yeah, and I should have said that at the top of the presentation, but any high school teacher who is the teacher of record for these courses has to attend a summer training that's developed by the faculty who create this course and by my team, so that they're not only getting an overview of how to teach the course, what the course entails, what the challenge exam entails, but they're also getting how does test administration work, when is the test window, those sort of logistical things about the course.
So that's a one-time opportunity for each of those teachers, or do they have another opportunity, or how are you engaging with them when you see that the results are as low as they are, and then to make the strides to make the improvements? Is there additional follow-up in another professional development session, or email? What does that look like?
Yeah, so right now the way that summer professional development is structured is that it is asynchronous online. We got feedback from districts that travel was a burden during the summer months. And so high school faculty can do this training at any point during the summer, or they can save it for their in-service days right before the school year starts if they need to protect their summer. We, quite frankly, have been spending the majority of our time on these redesign efforts, but we have had preliminary conversations about identifying teachers who are having really great student success rates and having them develop specific training for the essay portion of the American History exam, or just overall curriculum development in a course where their pass rate well succeeds the state average. So we are moving in that direction, but we're not there yet.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Eby?
Yes, to follow up on Chairman Hargrove's question, do the teachers have to take the exam and pass the exam before they teach a class?
The high school teachers don't see the assessment at all. The college faculty develop it, and we actually have the college faculty take it several different times to ensure validity and reliability of all the questions that are showing
But
up.
how are we assured that the teacher who is teaching it has the content knowledge to pass that on? I mean, I'm not saying they take the exact test, but I know the test will change. But how do we assure that the teacher who is teaching it has the content knowledge to pass on to the student?
Right. So the statewide dual credit courses are aligned to all of the high school course offerings. And so there are specific endorsements that teachers have to be able to teach the course. And then we add the additional layer of the summer training with our own curriculum resources to help prepare them to be able to teach students in these classes.
Okay, and I had one other question. So if a student passes the course, they get college credit for it. Do they get a grade for that, so that grade would impact their GPA in college, or do they just get credit for the hours?
Oh, great. That's a great question. So it is treated as transfer credit. It doesn't factor into their college GPA, but it does factor into the overall number of credits that they're bringing in with them.
Yes, Dr. Rowland.
Thank you. Zachary, I have a more holistic question. I know we have statewide dual credit, we have dual enrollment, AP, IB, any number of EPSO options, which I think is great that we have all of this suite of different opportunities for students. How do you see districts making decisions on which ones to offer? Is it ever overwhelming or maybe inconsistent, or does it feel like districts are selecting based on some factor? How are they coming to these decisions?
Mm-hmm. We have always encouraged sort of a diverse portfolio of options to ensure that there is a level of student choice and excitement about the courses that they're selecting from. Some of our opportunities, especially our CTE opportunities, are unique, and so that sort of fills a niche that AP doesn't. Some of our courses also can be taken by 10th graders. And so they can take these courses in preparation for their dual enrollment opportunities in their 11th and 12th grade year. There is some overlap, as has been pointed out, between some of our courses and AP courses. What I've heard anecdotally from some districts is they'll prioritize opportunities like dual enrollment because a student just has to get a 70% or higher to bank that college credit, whereas with AP or statewide dual credit, there's an exam that you have to take. And so we do see districts thinking about what's going to be the sort of lowest stakes way, for not necessarily easiest way, but how can we relieve some of the pressure of getting that college credit, which can be associated with courses like SDC because it's that one exam at the end of the class. But with dual enrollment, it's the entire course and it's the course grade. Mm-hmm.
Just a Question, if I was a 10th grade student and I was signing up for, or I had the option, because there's only so many classes you can take in a year, so many you can take in 4 years, and so there's a finite amount I get to take. And you were my college counselor, and I sat down and said, okay, I can take AP US, or I can take this SDC, American History 2. What would the answer be? How would you respond to that in communicating to me, the student and the parent, on the benefits of taking one or the other?
Yeah.
Thank you. I know it's a hypothetical, but I'm trying to discern how we're directing kids into what direction.
Yeah. So it's a little complex, but I do think that there are some sort of decision tree, the trees that guide those conversations. So I think sometimes for some families, they will want to take the AP course over a dual enrollment or a statewide dual credit course because there's a perception that the AP course is more well recognized at the institutions that they want to apply to. So I think generally a piece of that conversation is talking with that student about where you want to go to school, what do you want to major in, and then helping them sort of understand the different ways that these opportunities help them get to the college of their choice.
So just make sure I understand it correctly. So really the conversation would be, if you're looking to stay in state for higher education, it's a much more flexible option with transfer credits for where you can go, for how those can go from any college in the state of Tennessee, whereas AP would be recognized in Tennessee and outside of Tennessee. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
But I would say even if a student, their number one school is the University of Tennessee, they may still choose AP over statewide dual credit. I think another piece of this is just what opportunities are available at their school. We know that there are some school systems that don't have any AP offerings. And so this statewide dual credit becomes their way of offering early post-secondary opportunities to students.
In the minds of the colleges, since you're working with public, private, and all the ones from around Tennessee, when you talk to them about how they view students coming out of high school that have either SDC credits or AP credits, what is, I guess, is there a common perception between the two? And if there is, what is the goal of, sort of what's the brand we're trying to grow inside the SDC?
Sure. So colleges I would say, it's hard to make blanket statements about everybody, but I would say.
No one's going to hold you to a generality.
Right,
I'm the one throwing hypotheticals.
No, you're totally fine. Colleges will view these opportunities pretty equally in Tennessee, and I say that because their funding formula is structured in a way where student success is measured as a part of their funding formula, and so any of these more rigorous opportunities are creating students who are more prepared for college level work, and so generally colleges are just excited for students to have these opportunities and to be coming in with credits because it helps them with some of their goals and benchmarks of helping students reach 12 hours and then 24 hours and 36 hours because it all plays into their goals around student success.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments for Mr. Adams? Thank you very much.
you.
Very
Yes.
informative and much appreciated. The next agenda item is strategic compensation. Ms. Martha Moore.
Good morning. Thank you for giving me a few moments to talk to you about strategic compensation and differentiated pay. I'm Martha Moore. I'm the Senior Director of Educator Effectiveness for the Department of Education. And I am working on making the clicker do what it's supposed to. Differentiated pay is designed as a recruitment and retention strategy for teachers across the state. It is a requirement for every district to develop and implement a differentiated pay plan, and it's governed both in code and in policy. State Board Policy 5.600 is our policy by which we develop our practices and procedures. So Tennessee Code tells us that a state salary schedule must be established. It's established in coordination with the commissioner and the state board, so we do that every year. Differentiated pay is connected to this in that any kind of salary schedule that a district implements must meet or exceed the state minimums that we set. When we approve state alternative salary schedules within differentiated pay and strategic compensation, they're approved for 3 years. They may not result in any educator in the district dropping in pay or losing any kind of compensation as a result. But it does give the districts flexibility in how they are compensating teachers as opposed to simply compensating on degree or experience as a step in lane kind of pay plan. When we get into the actual differentiated pay plans that we require districts to develop and implement, they are to be reviewed annually. The plan, again, is supposed to aid in staffing hard-to-staff subjects, hard-to-staff schools, and retaining and recruiting good, strong teachers into classrooms. Differentiated pay plans are designed to address 3 particular areas as listed on this slide. So we have high-need subject areas or schools. That's our hard-to-staff component. Instructional roles and responsibilities. That's for teachers that are taking on additional duties that allow them to support other educators in supporting students. And then pay for performance, which is defined at the district level, but typically it's paid on LOE or test results, on their TVOS results.
Ms. Moore?
Yes.
What, out of those 3, what do you see as the most common, and I guess they could pick all 3 if they chose to,
Yes.
but what do you see as the most commonly used by districts?
So they are required to pick one of the 3. Most districts implement 2, and the 2 most common are instructional roles and responsibilities and pay for performance. We do have a hard-to-staff component that they can choose from, and some do. The problem that we run into is if the district is unable to implement the hard-to-staff component, then the plan itself becomes non-compliant if that's their only component. So we typically counsel them to have at least 2. And again, hard-to-staff is our least used. It's instructional roles and responsibilities and pay for performance that tend to be used more often.
Is it least used because that's the most difficult to fill those positions with the hardest staff?
It may be. I think there's, of course, now this is me getting into the heads of directors of schools that are developing these plans. I think there is a desire to ensure that the maximum number of teachers in a district get some kind of extra compensation. And hard to staff is fairly narrow. That says, for example, I can't find a physics teacher, so the only person that can get this particular bonus would be a physics teacher. Whereas if you pay for instructional roles, that's also predictable, very predictable. Every instructional coach in the district gets this particular bonus. Or performance, and I can say all of my teachers that meet the minimum I set will get a bonus. So it's a little bit more predictable to use instructional roles and responsibilities, a little more broad sweeping to use performance, and much more specific to use hard to staff.
So by broadening it out, the way you're talking, where everyone gets a little bit of it, are we defeating the purpose of differentiated pay?
Well, I guess it depends on what a district wants to incentivize. So if a district is electing to incentivize performance, so we want to incentivize teachers to focus on our state test and ensure that that to the best of their ability they are meeting or exceeding expectations, then that's what a district would use. If you have a district that's much more concerned about, you know, again, hard to staff roles, like we really need to focus on getting really strong English teachers in the classroom and we're struggling to get special ed, ELA specialists, then they would move their money that way. So again, I think it's more about what the district wants to incentivize and what they need than it is diffusing the plan or defeating the purpose, because teachers stay when they're compensated well. So if they can perform and receive compensation, that's a retention strategy.
I have a question to follow up with regarding performance. How many districts are using performance? And do you know which districts are doing that, using it?
Off the top of my head, I do not know that. I can get
Just
you that
roughly?
data,
Okay.
but I would say every district has to submit the plan, and I would say 50% plus are paying off performance, maybe 75% plus.
Okay, very good, thank you.
Any other questions on the components?
And just remind me again, so I remember when we first talked about this, the idea was that it's trying to give districts flexibility to create strategy around identifying teachers in hard-to-fill areas. And that, sort of they wanted to have the agency to be able to do that. And is that still the thrust of this? Because this looks more sort of like criterion-based versus, hey, I need a chemistry teacher and it's really hard to find one here. So how do those things work together, I guess is the question.
I would say fundamentally, yes, that is still the desire, is to give districts as much flexibility as possible to develop the plan that suits their needs. So, Metro Nashville may not have a struggle at getting a physics and chemistry teacher, but Smith County High School might. So Smith County might be really focusing on those advanced math or STEM teachers, whereas Metro might really need special ed teachers. So there's still a lot of flexibility. The districts define what hard staff is for them. And then the districts also define the roles and responsibilities they're paying for, and they also get to define what performance is. So is performance LOE, is performance TVOS, TCAP, is it ACT? So there's still a lot of flexibility. The policy truly gives the districts control over how they allocate money to incentivize teacher performance, student outcomes, and the rest.
Okay, thank you.
How do you track the effectiveness of the differentiated pay in the districts to meet those requirements? In other words, I'm a district and I say, I'm going to use mine for improved performance, or I'm going to use mine for hard to track. How do you track whether that differentiated pay made a difference?
So every district submits their plans, the plans are reviewed, and then feedback is given as needed for any kind of necessary improvements. We also get implementation data. So ideally, performance tends to make this a little bit harder for a district, performance pay. But ideally, as a district submits the plan for the upcoming year, they're submitting implementation data for the previous year. So we know what happened in that district. The district said, we have X number of roles, we paid out on Y number of roles in this way. And so that way we are able to track what's happening. So is the district implementing the plan as planned or not? And then in terms of the effectiveness of pay on what is happening with those teachers, that would be a much broader scale than just the strategic compensation policy and plan. But we do look at what's happening in teachers and their performance. So are districts exceeding expectations? What does it look like on our tests as our test results come back in across the state? So I don't know that that's a direct answer to what you're asking me. Can I say that this district's plan made this impact on these students' outcomes? I don't know that I can track that for you, but I can say we see teachers responding positively to pay bonuses and staying put, especially our higher performing teachers. They are staying in those classrooms more frequently. And again, I had a conversation with an educator from Kingsport yesterday who was very motivated as a result of what differentiated pay could do for her in the classroom. We are working at the department to connect some dots in this space, and we're really excited about where we're moving forward in this work, especially with vacancy data collection, which we will talk about next. So part of this policy is that we collect vacancy data from every district. We're in the policy process of doing that right now. And we are looking to see what the vacancies look like. As of today, about 50% of our districts had reported. We had somewhere around 250 vacancies. There were 80 some odd in elementary and high school and 60 some odd in the middle school bands. We also have not heard from some of our larger districts. So I think those numbers will continue to shift and probably balloon as we hear from our bigger districts. I think Montgomery was the largest one we'd heard from recently. But the plan with vacancy data is that we can see what is going on with the district and say, okay, clearly, district, you are having struggles because you have X number of vacancies in special ed. How can we help you use this plan to address what's going on with your hard to staff roles, with the vacancies that you're seeing? And we all know that schools are struggling with vacancies right now, with substitutes, with filling, just getting people in front of classrooms can be a bit of a challenge. So we anticipate this becoming more and more useful data and more necessary as we coach and counsel those that are developing these plans. Currently, vacancy data has been due July 30th. That is not, this is one of the things that we want to address in our conversation today. That has not been a particularly useful date because July 30th, you're still staffing schools and your vacancies are not truly reflective of what is going to happen as you implement school. So one of the things we want to talk about today is the timeline in which we are collecting this data and then how it can impact what a differentiated pay plan might look like. So our proposed changes to our policy are listed on this slide. I do want to make a slight adjustment. The last box on the slide says these policies no longer exist, referring to the teacher, leader, and professional learning standards. They do exist. They don't exist as a pair anymore, and they are captured differently. It's actually policy 5.200. So that statement is slightly misleading. They exist. They just do not exist as they are captured in this policy, in the language of this policy. The things we'd like to do is to increase clarity is change the word educator to teacher. And I think that's important because differentiated pay plans are focused specifically on teacher pay, not administrator pay, not supervisor pay, not EA pay, but teacher pay. So while a district is not prevented from providing a stipend to a principal or an assistant principal, it's not part of the requirements of differentiated pay. So this focuses specifically on teacher recruitment and retention. We'd also like to get a little bit more flexible in how we are using vacancy data to inform the differentiated pay plans. So plans are due, it has to do with fiscal years and working with county commissions, but plans are due before the school year starts. Vacancy data should be collected after the school year starts. So we want to work with districts to allow them to say, hey, we submitted a plan in June. We now have some new data in October, and we think we'd like to make some adjustments to our plans. And we want to make sure we're capturing in this policy that they have the ability to be flexible in the implementation of their plan so that we're not holding them to something that turns out with new data to be less than robust for their district. We'd also like,
Owen has a question.
I'm sorry.
Dr. Owen.
Quick clarifying question, Martha. When we say vacancy data, is that counting people teaching on permits and waivers as vacant or as staffed?
We are considering those staffed numbers, and we are actually generating that data at the department now. Previously, we've asked districts to submit that, and it fluctuates. So I've been working with the educator licensing and preparation team, and what we're going to do is capture that at the end of the year so that districts can use that data as they plan for the next year to see where they are in their permits and waivers. But no, they are not considered vacancies. They're considered filled but positions.
I gotcha. So if we were counting those as vacant in the sense of not having an appropriately licensed and endorsed teachers, those vacancies could look even higher.
Correct. That is true. That is an accurate statement. Madam Chairman, did you have a question?
No, I was just calling on Dr. Owen. Thank you.
Thank you.
One quick question. Is there a hope or is there a plan, or you may already have it, but for predictability? So instead of responding in reverse, is there a way to be able to sort of start looking at trend lines for each county or each district and saying, hey, we average this many vacancies in these certain areas, so we can set a sort of strategic plan moving forward? I just want to make sure that we're not always playing catch up and trying to get ahead.
That is exactly what we want to do. What our team, my team, is hoping to do is to take the vacancy data, which we've now been collecting for, I think we've got about 3 cycles worth, and with some feedback from districts, they're now suggesting that we might collect it twice a year, once each semester, so that we can see what's happening over the Christmas break. But with that, yes, what we want to do is look and say, okay, in 2020, this is what it looked like. And you're in 2023 and you still have gaps in, pick the subject, special ed, that's an easy one to always have a gap in. So what are you doing as a district to deal with that proactively, to your point, instead of retroactively? So when we get plans, and I think that there may be a sense that these are submitted, they're checked off a list and moved on. When we get plans, we actually look at them, and we spend a lot of time picking through the plan and then going back to the district and saying, hey, we see this and we see that, and it might be beneficial if. So we do some coaching. Our goal is not to give districts more to do. Our goal is to give districts better plans, and plans that are approved, implementable, useful, and result in better performance for our kids because we've got teachers in front of them. So yes, we're trying to marry these two things and make it a much more proactive instead of a reactive process.
And just in terms of the support that's given to the districts, is that typically directly through your office, or are you using the core offices to work with the districts?
It is directly from our office. I don't think the core office is resistant to supporting, and especially in channeling, information to us. The core directors are really great about saying, I'm working with the district, they have these questions, but it's really designed from our office directly to the district.
And in general, are the districts receptive to the support that you're providing and helping to guide them and thinking
Yes.
through?
On the whole, they are grateful to have someone focusing and helping them think through these things. So yes, I think they are very receptive. We have gotten some feedback from TASPA that those folks are our HR people, and they're generally pretty focused on what's happening in pay and compensation. And so we've gotten some feedback from them about the types of resources they need, about the windows that work and don't work for submission. We probed with them about how we could submit the plans differently. Would it be good to do an e-plan? And got some feedback that it would not. So, it's like we really try to work with them to do what they need, not what we think they need. And as I said, we'd like to move the timeline for vacancy data collection to October, because vacancies that a school has in July are not inherently detrimental to students because they haven't started school. When we get to October and we still have vacancies, those are vacancies that are detrimental to students, and those are the ones we want to capture and address, because there are lots of opportunities to hire between July 1 and August 15th when everything's moving forward. So the October date really gives us a much clearer picture than the current date does about what's actually happening in a district with those vacancies.
Mr. Mullenhour, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Moore, thank you for your work in this area. I have a quick question.
Yes, sir.
When the current language was adopted, as I understand, back in 2017, there was a phrase, the majority of districts are implementing plans with minimal reach and impact to teachers. This was kind of in the prescript. Mm-hmm. How would you rephrase that? Does that statement still apply now? And if not, why?
No, I don't think that still applies. I believe that districts are creating and implementing policies that represent what they need. They don't look like each other's policies. If you pull two policies, they may both pay for performance, but they're not paying on the same type of performance or paying in the same way. So I think that now what we have are differentiated compensation plans that are actually tailored to what districts need and are much more effective at attracting and keeping teachers.
And kind of on that second comment, I realize that attracting is perhaps more difficult to measure. Are you seeing the retention metrics shift? What's the trend in the retention metrics specifically?
I think that is one of the things that we want to pull from these vacancy data trends that we're looking at to see if those are moving in one direction or another. So I can't give you an answer to that today, but I think once we get a couple more cycles of this vacancy data and can start to see where things are moving or not moving, we'll be able to answer that question.
So just to clarify, you're looking at vacancy as a measure of both attraction and retention. Mm-hmm. Those wrap up into that vacancy metric that you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Because, once we get teachers that are embedded in a district, are well supported, are well compensated, and set their roots, they stay, and those vacancies don't continue to rotate. And there are always going to be districts that have more turnover than others for various reasons, especially bedroom communities to larger, higher paying districts. Teachers will drive 30 minutes for that pay bump. So that's going to be true, but in those kind of bedroom communities, but I think what we'll be able to track is, are they consistently having the same kind of problems, or are they retaining teachers and not having large detrimental gaps in the same places over and over.
Mr. Eby?
Yeah, sort of following up in the same lane. When we established this, 4 years ago, I think the intent, again, to retain the teachers, the hard to find positions, the paper performance, all that is great. I think what we need to do, and I'd like to see maybe next year when you come back a year from now, is actual hard data on what the impact has been with differentiated pay. How many, what percent are being retained? What percent of the hard positions are being filled? How's the paper performance affected the impact on the students? So I'd like to see that if we can get it.
Absolutely, we can do that for you. And just as a quick recap of what we just talked through, we have alternative salary schedules. We haven't talked about those much. If you'd like to, we can. Alternative salary schedules that are due February 1, differentiated pay plans due June 30th. Currently, we have vacancy data that is due on July 30th. What we are proposing is to keep the first 2 dates the same and to push that third date into October, into a time frame that accommodates what districts need, because that's a time for fall break, but sometime in October that functions around all the different schedules and gives us a better sense of what's actually open in a district. And a few things that we are doing as we start to marry this vacancy data collection, differentiated pay, and think about the impact that it's having is we are looking at how we're collecting our data. We're making it a much cleaner process so that the data is more usable, more accurate, such as, collecting the permit waiver data ourselves so that we know that's accurate. We're trying to pull together various teams at the department to put our heads together around what's happening. So if a district is struggling with federal requirements such as special ed ratios, how do we engage with the special populations team to provide supports to those districts? So again, not just turn in a plan, you get a check mark, but turn in a plan, we see where you have needs, we connect you to resources that can help close those gaps for you. So we've got a really robust team of people that are working on that together. We have reached out to various stakeholder groups, gotten feedback from them about what works, what doesn't, and we're working on a communications plan to really to share with districts what we're doing to try to make this an enveloping process, not a compliance process.
Mr. Ferguson?
Just a question. The world that we're living in today is very different than just a couple of years ago. Do you think that what we've got in place here is going to work for us going forward when you've got, I'm assuming, a labor market that maybe folks are looking at other options and looking to exit?
I think anytime we can recognize where a teacher is excelling, capture that, compensate them for that, I think that adds a layer of satisfaction. And while, teachers teach for students, we do. We love these kids. We think, in my own team, we talk about students every single day, even though we are not seeing them every day. So yes, I think it is a strategy that will help us moving forward. I think we can be more robust about how we approach it. I think we can provide more supports, connect them more deeply to content specialists that can help a district close gaps and think about how they're strategically moving forward and attracting teachers. The world is changing, and so our policies will need to change with them, and we may find some places that we want to expand or just pull back from. But I do think anytime we could say, you are doing a good job, and we're responding to this by saying, here's some financial compensation for it, I do think that's a strategy that helps us keep people in the classrooms.
Mr. Mullenhour?
Thank you. And really to pull comments from Mr. Ferguson and Mr. Eby together, and then to pair those with a Wall Street Journal article that came out this week that was talking about how private industry is pulling teachers out of the classroom. It seems to me that this strategy would impact both allocation of teacher talent within the system, but it also has the potential to keep that talent in the system. It seems like in order to measure that effectively, we have to make sure that we understand when someone, a teacher, decides to opt out of that system altogether, we need to understand why and what the influences were on that decision. Are you collecting data on that topic relevant to this program?
We are not, in terms of looking at exit interview type responses. I would think, and again, I'm reaching into what I think a director of schools or his HR staff might be thinking about, or his or her HR staff. I would think that districts would be exploring that and thinking about that as they develop their plans. I think that's actually a very worthy conversation to have, to say, as you developed your plan, do you have data on why you're not keeping these teachers? I think that's something to explore, for sure.
Is that something that you could commit to doing?
I would like to look at what that would take in terms of bandwidth for the team before I can say, yes, we can work with HR directors to get exit interview data. I would prefer to pause on that answer and do a little more research before I give you a final answer on that question.
Okay, I'll just highlight Mr. Eby's comments earlier. That strikes me as one of the most important questions that we could press into. And it may not be, maybe the most effective way is not 5.6. Maybe there's some other mechanism, but it seems like we have to have that information in order to strategically approach the bigger issue of how do we keep teachers, qualified, talented teachers with the right heart in the system, and then we can figure out how to allocate them within the system.
And, you know, I think there's also what is happening when teachers are moving with not just within a system, but within the larger system of the state. And then, you know, because that's a different thing than moving out of the system as a state as a whole.
Yeah, and that's what I was referring to, is
Yep.
the state system. How do we understand
Absolutely.
the trends? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Other questions or comments?
Just out of curiosity, do we have any prediction? I mean, I know we've all read the articles about different industries, education not excluded, for you know, people trying to find other places to go because it's been so hard. Do we have any idea or any prediction or survey analysis of what we think we'll be facing as a state in the teacher workforce for the upcoming school year?
The vacancy data we're collecting now will help predict what we will be seeing as we go into the next school year. A vacancy that a district is holding right now is a vacancy they are probably very unlikely to be able to close this school year. So I think that will be very predictive of what's going to happen next year.
I think the one piece of information we do have is that by 2025, I think a little over 30% of our teachers will be eligible for full retirement.
Other questions or comments? Excellent discussion. Thank you so much, Ms. Moore, because the conversation and the way that you responded to the answers were just excellent, in my humble opinion. Obviously, we know that this is as critically important. The compensation is vital to everything that we just talked about in terms of being able to attract and retain teachers. So without belaboring it, I just want to thank you because I appreciate your passion that you displayed. Obviously, you know your work exceedingly well, and so thank you so much for this discussion today and for sharing this information.
Thank you. I appreciate the time to talk about these things, and I appreciate the input and the sparking of ideas. The more eyes and brains that are on any of our topics, the better we have as we develop our processes and plans, the better outcomes we have. Thank you.
Thank you. The next topic is residential mental health facilities, and I'm likely to butcher his last name. Scott Mule? You're going to correct me. Please make sure we understand.
Sure. My name it's pronounced Indermill. So if you kind of get rid of a lot of those vowels and just think of in the mill, Indermill, that's probably the easiest way to do it. So I want to thank the board for allowing me to present today. I'm going to be talking about Public Chapter 589 and the development of the State Board of Education rules for that public chapter. Clicker. There it is. I'm going backwards, I'm sorry. As I said, my name is Scott Indermill. I work in the Division of Federal Programs and Oversight, and I have senior directorship over 4 teams. It was 3, just a new team just in the past few months. The IDEA team, which is the Individuals with Disability Education Act team, so around special education oversight and monitoring. The new IDEA team, which is going to be focused on the APR work, the annual performance report for special education. The IEA program, which is a state program, of course, the voucher program, and then the work with the non-traditional education team. And that work revolves around juvenile detention centers and residential treatment centers and N&D facilities, working closely with the Department of Children's Services as well. You guys are all familiar with the strategic plan, the Best for All. And when we look at Public Chapter 589 and these students that are being placed in these residential treatment centers, not only within the state, but the focus on out-of-state placements, we want to ensure that they continue to receive that high level of education and continue to build on those post-secondary opportunities. The agenda today, I'm going to focus on 3 primary areas, and then the last one, just some time for questions. But at any point, like you've been doing, I'm willing to answer any questions throughout the presentation. The first piece is just a review of Public Chapter 589 and TCA 493370. Then I'm just going to give a brief overview of placements for students in residential treatment facilities. Then I'm going to talk about changes from the first reading to the second reading that we've made at the department and proposed at the department. All right, so let's get into just a review of Public Chapter 589. So this public chapter focuses on students that are placed in residential treatment centers in the state and out of the state. And if certain requirements are met based on law, then the LEA, the local education agency, that school district would allocate those BEP funds to this facility, as long as, again, these requirements are met for the in-state and the out-of-state placement of these students. This public chapter was approved and passed by the General Assembly in May 5th of 2021. And then Governor Bill Lee signed that into law on May 27th of 2021. It went into effect this past school year, so in August of 2021 was the first year that went into effect. Oops, I'm sorry. So the first part of the public chapter looks at students that are placed in residential mental health facilities in state. And there's 3 requirements that must be met for the allocation of those funds from LEAs to these in-state residential mental health facilities. One being that the residential mental health facility operates as a Category 1 special purpose school. And of course, those rules have been developed by the State Board of Education for Category 1 special purpose schools. Requiring those 16 and a half hours at a minimum of instructional educational services, unless the IEP requires additional services above and beyond that would have to be implemented at the facility. The second piece would be that the student was enrolled in and attended a public school in Tennessee for 1 full year, immediately preceding the admission into the facility. And then that third piece would be that the placement is based on a signed written order by a licensed physician in Tennessee. So those are the 3 main requirements for within state facilities. Any questions about those 3 pieces?
One quick question, just when they say 1 full year, is that the 1 full calendar school year? Is
Yes.
that okay, so it has to be the full calendar school year.
Yeah, so it'd be that full school year, the year prior to the admission year date. We have some similar language in our IEA program as well about qualifying for that for the 1 full school year preceding the admission date to this facility.
Is that a hard and fast, or is there like a plus minus a few days on both sides? I'm just curious.
That's hard and fast in the law.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So then the public chapter shifts to out-of-state placements for these students. It also adds in quite a few additional requirements, going up to 13 requirements that must be met for the allocation of these funds to transfer between the LEA to this out-of-state facility. The first one being that there are no facilities in the state that can meet the educational needs or the needs of the student in terms of their mental health treatment. The second piece would be that the facility operates in a state that borders physically Tennessee. The third piece would be that that facility has served 15 Tennessee students per school year. And similar to the previous question, we would be looking at the students served the previous year. So looking at that 15, that number as 15. And those students can be, since some of the needs of these students sometimes can be that they are in these residential treatment centers for short periods of time, they return to the LEA, and then they continue to struggle with some of their needs, and then they're placed again, so that duplicative account would kick into gear. So even if a student were to attend a facility in Georgia, return to Tennessee, return to Georgia, that would count as 2 students. And that's similar to some of the DCS duplicative account numbers for monitoring data as well. The fourth piece is similar to in-state, that facility operate, similar to a Category 1 special purpose school as designated in Tennessee. Any question about those first 4?
Yes, a couple more. Just what agency or who oversees sort of quality control within those institutions, and just making sure that there's we're sending students to appropriate places.
Yeah, so this kind of works as an application process for these out-of-state facilities to be approved at like 2 different levels. So they would have to provide the Department of Education, and that would be housed in the non-traditional education program, one of my work streams. So we would be the one to look at all that evidence, all that documentation, collaborate with the non-public team, which is a different team in the department, to ensure that each of these first 4 that we've gone through do meet the requirements and the criteria as for the 13 pieces.
Thank you. One other question. So a lot of these students have IEPs, and there's a lot of time and needs are coming with those students. What are the safeguards where if a student is assigned to this facility and they are there for short term, that their IEP and their plan is going with them and not arriving after, like, with a delay, and especially when you look at, like you just said, of they're in, then they're back to the LEA, and then they're back to another one, and just what are those safeguards where the documented and regulated needs of a student are following them to those places to make sure they're getting adequate care?
Sure. So the student, and we'll get into some of the other requirements, the student stays enrolled in the Tennessee school district, and they stay enrolled in that school in Tennessee. So that IEP team and that LEA is still responsible for the FAPE, the free appropriate public education of that student. So they would be involved in meeting with this facility educational staff, working through any type of addendums to the IEP, ensuring that progress reports and progress is happening. So there's going to be a communication between the LEA as the FAPE responsibility entity or authority with these facilities.
I guess I have one more question.
Sure.
That you said that was just great. How's that work? I mean, that seems like having been on that side of that as the instructor. I mean, that's a challenge, and what are the challenges? I guess I'm curious that they're facing in that.
I think the challenge is just distance, but even within the state, if students have been placed or a student, if a district contracts with another school district or a state special school, they're still involved with the development and the implementation and the FAPE pieces with these students. Distance is distance, even if it's one county over or one bordering state over. It's really going to be the obligation and the responsibility to ensure that these LEAs are staying involved in the education of these students, because ultimately, like I said, they're still enrolled in this LEA. They're still responsible, working with this facility and the education staff to ensure that this IEP is being implemented. Not only implemented, if addendums need to happen, emotional needs change, and these students are the students that are their needs are changing constantly, so they're going to have to really collaborate well with these out-of-state facilities. All right, I will move on. So the fifth requirement would be similar to what's required in the Category 1 special purpose school, that minimum of 16 and a half hours of instructional services to the admitted student. Again, unless the IEP requires above and beyond that. So, you know, whatever's in the IEP, that still is a federal requirement under IDEA, so that would still need to be implemented above and beyond that 16 and a half hours. Number 6, each state has, and each locality in that state has their own health and safety regulations and codes. So that facility is going to have to provide us evidence that all those regulations and codes are being met based on that state and that locality. 7, this gets into licensure. So all of the staff at these facilities are going to have to be licensed by their educator, licensing authority for that state, their Department of Education. And also going to 8, they must have one special education teacher that is endorsed. So that is a must, because of course these are going to be students with IEPs and they're going to have to be served. And then number 9 is an important piece right here, and that is a sufficient number of teachers with an endorsement in special education. If there is a facility with numerous students that have numerous needs, numerous goals, numerous service hours, this LEA and working with the state are going to have to ensure that they have the appropriate staff, be it related service providers as well in the IEP, that can fully implement the IEPs for these students. Any questions about 5 through 9? All right, 4 more. Going back to kind of what I was saying before about how the student stays enrolled in the LEA, this facility is going to have to report daily attendance to the school that the student came from. So that's going to be one of these pieces at the LEA level that they're going to have to continue to monitor, that is this facility providing the attendance for this student every single day like they would have if they were actually attending in person in that school. Number 11 is kind of going back to what we talked about, that IEP, is that student's IEP is fully implemented at the time of the medical placement, that doctor's placement into the facility, and any subsequent amendments to that IEP, that this LEA is ensuring that they're participating in those, they're part of that. They still have to have the required IEP team. Everything stays the same to ensure that the needs are being met for the student. Number 12 is similar to the in-state placements, and that is that enrollment piece of attending a Tennessee school for 1 full year, immediately preceding the student's admission to the facility. They also include a word that is called active IEP, and we have something similar to that in our IEA board rules as well, and we going through defining that right now, and that would be to ensure that that IEP was being implemented in that school system, at that school, at the time that between the student is medically placed in that facility outside of state. So that active piece is, did they just have an IEP that wasn't being implemented? Well, that's not active. So active IEP means there has to be evidence that that IEP was being implemented with fidelity as required. And the last piece is just that doctor statement again, a signed written order of a qualified physician licensed to practice in medicine in Tennessee. And again, medical necessity is the big piece for both in-state and out-of-state placements. So those are the 13 requirements in public chapter that these out-of-state facilities would have to have first level approval pieces, and then when the students come, the individual like IEP pieces and enrollment pieces and attendance pieces to ensure that there is an appropriate allocation from the LEA to the out-of-state facility.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions or comments for Mr. Indermill?
Indermill, yes.
I think I got it right. What was that? Oh, there are more slides?
Oh, there's more slides, yeah.
I am so
I'm sorry.
sorry. I thought you said that was the last one. I apologize.
That was just the last of the 13. I'm sorry. I misspoke. The final pieces of public chapter just deal with the ability of the LEA in collaboration with the state education agency, the department, to monitor for compliance. So there are certain pieces, if you look into the proposed rules, in which the LEA is responsible for, like the attendance piece and the IEP participation and the implementation. And then the Department of Education would be responsible for those compliance pieces as well. And just that at any time, you know, if there is non-compliance, that those allocations would cease. And then the last piece is, of course, we talked a lot about IDEA, that there would not be anything in this rule or law that would circumvent the requirements of IDEA in serving those students with a FAPE. I want to give you just a brief overview of how students are placed in residential treatment centers, because I think it's important for this public chapter when we think about the development of these board rules, because there's a lot of different ways that this can happen. When we think about what is a residential treatment center, it's a very intensive, probably most restrictive environment for these students with disabilities, because they're removed from students who have disabilities, right? So they're with students with disabilities, so remove the students without disabilities. They're there 24 hours, they're away from their family, but there are times when students and these youth need that level of care. So that is it. So they have significant psychiatric and therapeutic needs that just requires 24-hour therapeutics. The second piece is when you think about residential treatment centers and the placement in there, you also have to consider the diagnosis, the individual treatment plan when considering how long is the student going to be there, and that can change. Like I said, some students can return multiple times in 1 year because they're not stable anymore. So there are a lot of things to consider when placements happen. In Tennessee, there are 48 residential treatment centers that are serving these youth right now. 37 of those 48 are associated with DCS.
What are the other 11? The ones that are not
private.
Private.
Mm-hmm. Now, some of these facilities too, even though DCS they're affiliated with, they also have some private beds as well. So it's going to be a combination.
Do you have any idea of the overall occupancy of these?
It varies. I'm not sure the number of beds. When I say beds, you know, like spots for the kiddos. I'm not sure. Some facilities are as small as, you know, like 8, and then some have over 100. It just depends.
I just have an impression that the demand is probably more than the supply.
It's a good impression, yes. Mm-hmm.
And just out of curiosity, and so when we really get into some of these significant medications and treatments and the therapeutic treatments, who assists with coordination of services, from primary care pediatricians to the on-site facility directors to the doctors and psychologists who are employed by the residential facility? Like, how does that work? Who helps the family? I'm just thinking of the family there. Who helps the family there in the coordination of services, medical services, therapeutic services?
Yeah, so each of these students that are there, they're going to have a case manager that's going to be assigned to them within that facility.
Okay, from the facility?
Yeah, from the facility. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And they would do that coordinating. In terms of the LEA, you know, they would be just focused on, because these aren't LEA placements, these are doctor's written order placements. So the LEA would just be focused on that IEP and working with the facility to ensure the IEP is being implemented. A few more things about placement. Placements can be through DCS. They can be court ordered by a judge. And of course, what we've been talking about is through a physician order. So in respect to what we're talking about with this public chapter in TCA and developing these board rules is for those placements made by a licensed physician. And of course, kind of going back to the previous question, the health insurance companies, you know, fund those treatments based on that medical necessity from the doctor's order. I'll just kind of hit on these a little bit, but for the most part, when we talk about placements, the mechanisms for placement can vary, but the actual criteria for admission is fairly standard. And there's a lot of areas they look at in terms of like a child having a significant mental health disorder through DSM-5. They're unable to adequately care for their physical needs like they have been. So they need that more intensive therapy. They need that more intensive treatment 24 hours a day. And then that last piece, when it comes to like that family environment and community support, they just can't make it without that, again, that intensive treatment, that 24-hour care around the clock. And just a few more pieces. Stability, that first piece we're talking about, they just can't achieve that level of stability without this increased intervention. When they're placed in the medical mental health facilities, they always consider age, cognitive ability, disability, and of course what concerns are, because not every residential treatment center is the same. Some focus on substance abuse, some might be sexual abuse, so it just depends on what the need is for that placement. And then some of these children pose a high risk for elopement, and those are those peer and social concerns that the family has for them. So any questions about residential treatment placements? I know that was a really quick overview.
Yes. There is a question for Mr. Mullenhour.
Thank you. I have a quick question. If I'm thinking about this from the perspective of the student, if the student is in Mountain City, for example, but the nearest available capacity as a new defined term is in Chattanooga, but they could hop across the state line much closer and be treated appropriately. How does this statute, how does this policy allow for those kinds of scenarios where there may be state capacity, but it may be clearly not the best available option to that student?
Yeah, it's really, I think it's going to really depend on the need of that student and what the facility can offer in terms to address that need. If they're choosing to bypass an open bed in Tennessee that could provide that treatment, and they want to hop over, like you said, the state line that's much closer, then that would be one of the considerations and requirements that would have to be considered for that allocation of funds to that facility.
In your experience, practically, how does that play out?
I think it's a real consideration for a student and a family that's in Memphis, and there could be a placement in Johnson City, but there may be a placement in the border in Mississippi. That could be a real consideration, and something that there's going to have to be evidence provided to meet that requirement if there's any contradiction.
And in your view, defining the term capacity in this way, does that make that more likely to benefit that child in that particular example? Or do you think that the person who's weighing those factors is going to look at this statute and be more hesitant to accommodate that student's needs?
Yeah, I think a family's going to make a personal decision on distance and meeting the needs. So I don't have any hard evidence or any data to support, if decisions have been made to go out of state or stay in state, depending on if there is an open bed.
So
And I don't know if that answered your question, so I apologize if it didn't.
You may have more questions, but I have a follow-up. With that being said, who's making the final determination whether the child stays within Tennessee or crosses the border to another state?
So the doctor's the physician's going to make that order, and then that's going to go to, that could be a variety of things. So there's various avenues. So it could be a counselor or a caseworker that's working with the student. It could be the insurance company saying that, hey, we're looking at open beds in Tennessee first before we place them out. So I think when you look at statute and when we go into some of the changes, statute really does have that freedom of flexibility in the language that allows some of these different avenues to determining if there's placement in Tennessee versus out-of-state placement. It's going to be something that when the student is placed out of state and there's assurance that there is no beds available in Tennessee to meet that need, that is something that that facility on the receiving end is going to have some evidence for.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
I guess I don't know of a better way to ask this, but how much weight does the insurance companies have in placement versus the family?
I don't have an answer for that.
Okay.
I can only assume it's great. I
Okay.
can only assume, but I don't have an answer for that.
All right. Okay. All right.
Great question, though.
So just to clarify, Scott, if it really came to it and there was a capacity in a bed clear across the state or right next door in a border state, there's nothing preventing the family from going to the border state, but they may be foregoing the opportunity to have the state BEP funds follow the student.
Correct.
So they're not being forbidden to have their child closer by.
Correct, yeah, and those decisions on the placement are out of our hands as a department, out of the LEA. It's family and the medical.
Seems to me a good physician could write it up that it's better for the individual to be close to his home than 400 miles.
All right, I'll keep moving along here. So now we're going to get into some of the proposed changes between the first reading and the second reading. So what you're going to see is no changes in terms of the 6 content areas: purpose, definitions, approval of out-of-state facilities, admission, compliance, and monitoring, nor the calculation of funds. You're going to see 3 slides that are going to cover these 6 content areas, and you're going to see the section. You're going to see some notes from the first reading, and then some final reading notes on some of the changes or revisions, or maybe no revisions. So if we look at, I should have brought my glasses. If we look at the purpose, nothing has changed with the purpose from first reading to the second reading. So there were no changes to that. When we get into definitions, it supports what we've just been talking about, and that's that capacity piece. That capacity language is in the law. We did not have a definition for it in the first reading, so we added that definition into the second reading to state a bed available in a Tennessee residential mental health facility to deliver the appropriate mental health treatment to the student at the time the student is admitted to the out-of-state facility. Any questions about that definition?
Should you add something as defined by the physician? Mental health treatment as defined by the physician?
Yeah, and I think when we get into the 4th content area, the first reading we did have the physician determines in-state, out-of-state. But in reality, that's not the case. The physicians are writing the order for the treatment, but they're not the ones searching for the in-state placement. Like I said, it's many different avenues. It could be the case manager, it could be insurance company staff. Those are the individuals that are doing it. And that's something that is out of our hands as an LEA, SEA, and it's out of the LEA's hands as well, because of course this isn't an LEA placement. So we decided to actually remove that language, which you're going to see in the next slide, about the physician making the determination of in-state versus out-state placement. Because it's just not reality that the physician's doing that research and trying to find the placement.
I guess I have a fear in this, and I don't know what I have to do with it other than voice it, I guess, initially, is I'm playing a scenario in my head, and that if I have the great fortune of a pediatrician and a parent who is going to strongly advocate for what is best and really make it a problem if they're trying to send us 400 miles versus 20 minutes, then there may be some ability to have that fixed. What I'm worried about is where there is not an advocate, where there is not a voice in that, where there may be, you're working with the foster system, or you're working with someone who doesn't have the same home situation.
Right.
And that there won't be any safeguards to help do what is best for an already vulnerable situation and an already vulnerable student. And so that's what makes me nervous in this, where in a room like this, capacity written down makes sense. We're talking about, okay, well, of course we would try to have it next door. And then, but in the back of my mind, I hear this creeping of, well, an insurance company's probably going to find this, and who is going to be sort of just being the advocate for the one who doesn't have voice and ability. And I would hate for us to put something in place unintentionally doing greater harm to a situation. So I don't know if you have an answer to that either. I'm inside and I want to just put voice to this fear I have that this all sounds great, but in execution, is it really going to happen that way? I don't know if you can speak to that or just say, yeah, that's a tough one. I don't know, but
it is
I'm really
tough.
uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, it is tough. And I think the thing that we have to understand is that these decisions can happen quickly. where there can be an event that happens over the weekend where the parents decide quickly with the physician that we need more intensive help, we need more intensive therapy, we need to put, our student in a residential treatment center. So these decisions are happening quickly without the knowledge of the LEA or of the department. So it's really hard to get involved after the decision's already been made. It is tough. I agree with you. The capacity language, like I said, is written into statute. So it's really difficult to identify and pinpoint every single avenue that decisions are being made when it's out of the department's hands or the LEA's hands. It's just privately between the parents and their physician on what the needs are for the student.
Other questions, comments? I don't want to cut you off
No,
like I did
that's
before.
fine. No, it's
You're
good. Just a few other pieces. When it came to some of the verbiage around the application forms, we just aligned the language to state standard initial application form, standard renewal application form. Just for clarity for the applicants who are the out-of-state facilities. There were no changes to the approval of out-of-state facility section. That is still going to be like that first level application piece that looks at the state bordering Tennessee, the Category 1, those pieces that are required under this statute. Looking at the next sections under admission, here's where I talked about reverting that language back to the capacity language that is in statute to open up that freedom of flexibility for all these different avenues to determining where that placement is going to be between the parent and the physician, or the parent and the insurance company, or the physician and the insurance company. The last piece, compliance and monitoring, we did add some verbiage that a facility that has been notified by the department of noncompliance shall lose its approval from the department until that noncompliance has been corrected. So that would be the only piece in that section that we did add some language to. And the last section is calculation of funds, and we did not make any changes to that. That is it for the presentation. I hope it helped a little bit in understanding what some of the changes are moving from first reading to second, and maybe a little better understanding of some of the placement decisions that are made often and most likely outside of the hands of the department and the LEA. Any questions for me regarding this presentation?
I think Mr. Eby has one more question at least.
Yeah, I go back to between the first and second reading, you took out, qualified physician and you just changed it to appropriate mental health. And I go back to Mr. Morrow's comment that, you could drive a truck through that. And so who is going to make that decision that's best for that individual? Is it the insurance company, which they may have a totally different incentive to do that. So, I guess I'm a little concerned that we've unintended consequences in changing that from qualified physician to a appropriate mental health. How do you define appropriate? That's the question.
Yeah, I just still kind of go back to that. These decisions are made privately between the parent and the physician. If a student is placed in an out-of-state residential facility, that's going to happen based on the needs of that student. When it comes to looking at the state board rule and what qualifies under statute and law, that's something that is going to have to be one of those components and requirements when we talk about capacity in-state versus out-state. Hopefully, when it comes to the needs of the student, regardless if it's in-state or out-of-state, they're getting what they need at this residential treatment facility. I think that's the important piece. This public chapter statute and these rules are going to be about that allocation of money. But when we always go back to what is this really about, and the big picture is about the student getting their needs met in a residential treatment center, in-state or out-of-state.
Yes, Dr. Rowland.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to back up just a little bit.
Sure.
And please correct me if I'm mistaken in misunderstanding. If someone has private insurance, then presumably a lot of this doesn't really matter because those children would be, their whatever program they choose, whether it's in-state or out-of-state, may be covered by that private insurance. What we're really talking about here is the kids who fall through that filter, who don't have insurance, who may not have an advocate. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing. What I'm trying to understand is, it seems to me like we have a fairly arduous set of requirements. If you look at the very bottom of that, it's and. It's not or. It's not 3 of 5
Right.
or 3 of 15, however many it is.
Right.
It's and. It's a very long list of boxes that have to be checked. What I'm trying to understand is, if we have capacity constraints here in the state already, and we recognize that some children may not have access to an open room or an option that's local to them, why do we want to make it so difficult for them to go across the state line? I mean, I realize that those tax dollars would be spent in a facility that's outside the state of Tennessee, but what's the rationale for making it difficult for those kids? I'm not talking about the ones with insurance. I'm talking about the ones who don't have insurance, may not have an advocate. Why would we want to make them check 16 or so boxes before we can apply BEP funds to making sure that they have the care that they need?
Yeah, I think when I look at it, I don't look at it as we're making it difficult. I think the public chapter sets forth a set of requirements that have to be monitored for the request for the facility to the LEA, like, hey, we want your BEP funds because we're educating your student. I think going back to what I said a few minutes ago, the parent and the physician and the needs of the student are going to be discussed, and this student's going to be placed somewhere if the written order happens and the insurance company feels that there is a medical necessity for that level of treatment. So I don't think as a department we're making it more difficult. We're just trying to find that application process for these out-of-state facilities so we can monitor and ensure that everything that's written into law in the public chapter is being considered and monitored for compliance if there is a request for allocation of funds.
Dr. Rowan?
Thank you. I would just reiterate what Scott is saying, that those 13 requirements with the and are all directly from statute.
Yeah.
And I really want to reiterate that the purpose of this statute is to make sure that these facilities that previously were not able to have these state dollars are able to have it flowing for the students for whom it's relevant, for those who don't have private insurance. So the rules are less so about, what's the right decision for the student, which I'm very much in sympathy with, but our role is really to establish the rules for how the money will flow. So I just want to be clear that that's more the purpose of these. Any further questions?
And just to clarify, as far as our responsibilities here, the statute establishes those 13 checkboxes. We don't,
Yes, sir.
even though
Right.
we're dicing the language a little bit in, I think, some potentially meaningful ways, those 13 boxes exist.
Those 13 boxes exist. The rules can further define and clarify, but they can't remove.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mr. James, did you want to add something?
Yes, Madam Chairman. And I would say, when this was going through the legislature, it took a while. It is something that had been introduced on several occasions and finally got through. And there was a lot of this sort of discussion that took place on the legislative side as well. So, yeah, we've always got the box of the statute there, and it's just a matter of trying to be where we need to be, where our consciences are collectively in the right place as far as the rule process.
Thank you for that. Once again, a critically important conversation. And I do want to say, I think you made it very clear in the way that you presented it, as well as the slides where you showed the changes. That was very beneficial. So thank you so much for that. We are definitely over time. I didn't want to cut this off because it is such a critically important topic. But we are going to stop now and take a 10-minute break. I believe it's almost 1:50. We'll pick up the next topic right after the break. We will come back promptly at 2 o'clock.
Okay, thank you for your time
Thank you so much.
and your questions.
Thank you. Board members, please return to your seats. It's 2 o'clock, and we are reconvening the meeting with the next presentation. Yes, that's when I need my gavel. It's on the floor, hiding. Ms. Ally Gaffey, Charter School Authorizer Evaluation Results.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Ally Gaffey, Director of Engagement and Accountability for the State Board. I am very excited to speak with you today about our outcomes for the first round of our authorizer evaluations. If you remember, we started this in summer 2019, and so here we are ready to share some results with you. I'm going to start with a brief reminder of our history and process before sharing the outcomes. So as I mentioned, back in 2019, that's when the General Assembly charged the State Board with ensuring the effective operation of authorizers in the state and ensuring authorizer quality. And we connected with other states. There currently are 3 other states that do a similar process. We connected with them to start building our process. We had focus groups, gathered feedback. We established a task force. And last, fall 2020, we actually held a pilot evaluation to test out our process. And then in February 2021, you all approved our rule and policy, which then set us up for the fall 2021 evaluations. So our authorizers, there currently are 6 authorizers across our state, and they are separated into 2 cohorts that are evaluated at least biennially. And this slide here shows our evaluation cohorts, which will not change regardless of evaluation outcomes. So you can see how we started with our 3 districts that I'll speak to today, and then we'll be doing the next round this fall, and it will repeat into the future. This slide shows our full evaluation timeline, which began in August with an orientation for authorizers, ran through each of the 3 evaluation weeks, and then also included a submission of a self-assessment from each of the evaluators who are in a non-evaluation year, those that are in our cohort 2. The evaluation week timeline itself actually runs over the course of 2 weeks, with the first week being the most intensive, and the evaluation includes a full document review by an evaluation team, a meeting with charter school leaders, a meeting with the authorizer, and the development of the evaluation report itself. Our evaluation team for each authorizer included 3 members. We had a State Board staff member, myself, a national consultant, and a Tennessee authorizer representative from a authorizer who is in a non-evaluation year. And our evaluators for 2021 evaluations, you can see here for each of them, and you'll notice that both myself and our national consultant were consistent across each of the 3 evaluations. Each evaluation focuses on a 2-year review term, and any documentation outside of that review term is not reviewed or considered. Authorizers submit corresponding documentation for randomly selected schools, and our evaluation team also reviewed clarifying information shared by the authorizer and school leaders, as well as any appeals history within the review term, if applicable. The State Board approved evaluation rubric is based on our State Board Policy 6.111, and it covers 6 categories that you see here, with the final category, advanced standards, as an opportunity for our authorizers to receive a few bonus points. Our evaluation teams objectively evaluated the evidence by comparing it against the rubric for each substandard to determine which performance level best represented the authorizer's practice. From there, they also developed evaluative comments, which briefly describe the evaluated documentation that was used to determine the rating, and specific feedback. So our authorizers had very clear details about how they can improve their practice. The substandard ratings are then averaged to determine the overall score, and the ratings are on the screen here. Authorizers receive their evaluation report, which you also received copies of, and those include the final scores, their evaluative comments for each of the substandards, an overall evaluation rating, and then any required follow-up actions. Any questions about the process?
you mentioned on your team that you had one member from one of the authorizers that was not evaluated this year. Next year, those 3 will be evaluated. I would assume that the member of the team evaluating them would not be from authorizer that they had evaluated. In other words, I would assume you'd switch those around. So.
Yes. Yes, so they will rotate. Authorizers have an opportunity to have one of their staff members participate every other year, anytime they're in a non-evaluation year.
But what I'm saying is that, say, Shelby Schools had an authorizer from Knox County on their evaluation team. Next year, when Knox County is being evaluated, I would assume that you would not have Shelby County being their outside evaluator, but it would be, that way you don't get into a potential conflict that's, well, you give me a good rating, I'll give you.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great point. Hadn't considered that, but we can definitely make sure that does not occur. Okay. Our 2021 evaluations included 3 of our 6 authorizers. So we evaluated Hamilton County Schools, Knox County Schools, and Shelby County Schools, and we're going to talk through each of their outcomes. So starting with Hamilton County Schools, this is an overview of who they are as an authorizer. Hamilton opened its first charter school in 2008 and has 5 schools that are currently open and operating, with 2 more schools in development. Within the evaluation report, we highlighted key areas of strength in addition to all of the feedback they received for each of their substandards. So I'm going to review the key areas of strength as well as the areas for growth for each of our authorizers. For Hamilton, our evaluation team identified these 3 areas of strength. They recently hired a full-time charter coordinator to support its growing portfolio of schools. They approve applications that demonstrate a high likelihood for success, and they prioritize their charter schools' autonomy, as well as provide opportunities for charter leaders and teachers to opt into district-level professional development. In terms of areas for growth, Hamilton County Schools currently lacks an established performance framework that's outlined in their charter agreement as required by state law, and has not yet conducted annual performance evaluations of its charter schools. Additionally, the authorizer does not have an established criteria for renewal and has inconsistently held its required 5-year interim reviews. Thirdly, the authorizer has not implemented a comprehensive accountability and compliance monitoring system, which is necessary to inform renewal, revocation, and intervention decisions. So Hamilton County Schools' overall rating was, within this first round, was a 1.83, which accounts to approaching satisfactory. Each of our overall ratings have specific follow-up actions that are tied to them. So for an approaching satisfactory, that requires the authorizer to complete a corrective action plan, as well as submit a self-assessment in their non-evaluation year. So that will be the 22-23 school year. And within that, they will be reporting out on the progress they've made in completing their corrective action plan items. Any questions about Hamilton's evaluation? Okay. Our second evaluated authorizer is Knox County Schools. Knox is our authorizer with the smallest portfolio. They have 1 charter school, which opened in 2015, and they do not currently have any schools in development. Our evaluation team identified 3 areas of strength, key areas of strength, I should say, within their evaluation. Firstly, they noted that their staffing model is sufficiently funded and effective given the size of their portfolio. They have a new start application process that's aligned to state guidelines and is prepared to be implemented should they receive a new application. And their charter agreement sets clear rights and responsibilities for both the charter school and the authorizer. In terms of areas for growth, the 3 key areas that the evaluation team identified was that while the authorizer does have a performance framework, it is not clearly established as part of the charter agreement and does not currently include organizational standards to hold its schools accountable for things such as student and employee rights, reporting requirements, and its governing board. The authorizer also lacks a comprehensive monitoring system that's aligned to its agreement and informs its renewal, revocation, and intervention decisions. And thirdly, its monitoring system does not ensure access and services to all students. It's not ensuring that its schools are providing those. So for Knox County, their overall score was a 2.94, which was a satisfactory rating, and their follow-up action includes the completion of a self-assessment again in the 22-23 school year. Any questions about Knox's evaluation? Okay. Our third and final evaluation this round was for Shelby County Schools. Shelby County is our largest charter school authorizer with 56 schools this last school year, and they serve, their charter schools serve about 18% of the district's students. In terms of areas of strength, our review team noted that Shelby County Schools implements a quality New Start application process that's transparent and open to all. They also follow a quality monitoring and intervention process that's clearly communicated, that notifies schools of deficiencies, and that honors charter school autonomy. And they revoke charters when there's clear evidence of underperformance or a violation in law. In terms of their areas for growth, Shelby County Schools lacks a clear authorizing mission and a relevant training opportunities for all members of their staff as well as their school board. They evaluate schools against a performance framework that's not clearly aligned, or rather I should say, not clearly outlined as an exhibit or an attachment to its charter agreement. And they lacked evidence of following each step of their own closure process when that occurs. So Shelby County Schools' overall rating here was a 3.53, which is our highest rating of exemplary. And the required follow-up actions for them includes completion of that self-assessment in the next school year, as well as recognition of best practices, which I'm going to share next. So a few of the best practices that Shelby County implements is that they firstly have developed some informational videos that they've placed on their website for their charter school applicants to review. That's going to inform them on all the parts of the process. They also publish a priorities document that outlines the greatest needs in each of the neighborhoods within Shelby County and details the seat quality and seat capacity that can inform charter school applicants. They annually publish a comprehensive guidebook for their operators, and within it, it details exactly what documents will be required for submission throughout the year, as well as what data is used to make determinations on their performance framework. They actually host a Charter School Leader Institute each summer, and they provide technical assistance and relevant training for charter school principals, CEOs or board chairs, and operations managers. And they created a set of sample intervention notifications to help streamline support and ensure consistent feedback to their schools should they be out of compliance. I also want to note that Shelby County Schools, their team does a really great job with sharing these resources with other authorizers. We have developed a few different opportunities for them to collaborate, and they have always been willing to share and support any other authorizers when asked. So I'd like to wrap up with just a few reflections from this first round of evaluations, and just thinking about how this is an iterative process, and we really rely heavily on our authorizers and our evaluators to help continue to inform this process and revise it. So the first takeaway that we had was something that we actually heard through the pilot evaluation and again echoed through this formal first round, is that our process is rigorous, thorough, and transparent, and that is certainly a goal of this evaluation. Also, our authorizers really value the opportunity to be involved in not just the development of this process as they were beginning in 2019 as we were starting it. They've been with us this whole time, but they also get to participate in the evaluation as an evaluator, and that is a tremendous professional development opportunity for them, as well as gives them an opportunity to really reflect on their practices between each of their evaluations. And our authorizers now have the opportunity through this process to annually self-evaluate, whether they're going through the evaluation themselves, they're doing that reflection, or they're in a non-evaluation year and completing the self-assessment, which I think is a real strength of this process. As we're considering things that we might want to adjust for the next cycle, that would actually begin in 2023. So if we think about the cycle itself, it runs through 2 years. We have each of the 6 split up into 2 different cohorts. And so we don't want to make changes too many changes right now, because that might unfairly influence the outcomes for authorizers that have not yet gone through this process. But we are considering a few different changes that we noted through this first round, as well as I'm expecting we will find some more in this next round again, and continue to improve upon the process. So one is the recalibration of the overall ratings. This is something that we knew when we developed the process initially. We'd want to make these adjustments to make sure we're continuing to hold a high bar and push our authorizers to a higher standard each round. The next one is to ensure that the process fairly evaluates our wide range of authorizers. We have Knox County with 1 charter school, we have Shelby County with 56, and we have state authorizers. And so we really need to be thoughtful about that we're maintaining a fair and consistent evaluation regardless of the situation that each of our authorizers are in. We also want to update the standards to ensure there are no duplicates. There is currently opportunities where you can potentially get double dinged for something. We want to remove that, and that the standards themselves are clearly stated, so it's very clear exactly what we're looking for when we're doing an evaluation. Consider specific advanced standards that allow authorizers to receive bonus points for actions that truly push beyond the day-to-day work of the authorizer. To allow authorizers the opportunity to submit missing documentation during the evaluation week as requested. You probably saw this in the evaluation reports. There were some moments where authorizers received lower scores because they did not submit something. And we certainly don't want to hold back points because something was not submitted. We'd rather be able to review the documentation in full and provide feedback. And so we're considering a small window to allow authorizers to submit any missing documentation if requested. And then finally, to make some updates to our rule to include specific requirements for that non-evaluation year self-assessment to ensure that all authorizers understand what's expected of them in that part of the process. As we think about these evaluation outcomes, I also want to note that we have been doing a lot of work in supporting our authorizers, not just as a result of the evaluation, but also just in day-to-day work. So we did provide technical assistance sessions at the end of the pilot that the pilot informed exactly what topics we wanted to focus on, and so that was last spring. I've also added to our State Board website charter authorizer contact information so that they know how to get in touch with each other and have that easily accessible. We started hosting bi-monthly Authorizer Connect meetings in which all of our authorizers attend, and they're discussing relevant topics based on the cycle of the authorizing work over the course of a year. Authorizers have access to a platform of video modules that is relevant to their work, and a lot of authorizers, as they have new staff joining or any turnover, have found this especially helpful. And the newest thing that we've just created is called a Quality Authorizing Series, and this was developed in thinking about the potential for new authorizers, or rather districts, to become authorizers, as there are several who have just received a charter application for the first time. And so we want to make sure that they are really set up for success on the front end and know exactly what's involved in being a quality authorizer before we come knocking on their door to evaluate them come 2 years from now. So here are those sessions that I was just discussing. We had one in January talking about you've just received a letter of intent. What should you do? How do you start preparing for that? And then next week, we'll be hosting an application review of how do you actually review an application? What does that look like? What's all involved in the process? From there, we'll talk about the appeals process, setting up an effective charter agreement, and then just what it means to be an effective authorizer. So you can see that runs over the course of the year. So with that, I'll pause here, open it up to questions. Nate, you look like you're just chomping out of the bit.
I am. I just wanted to affirm you. I think there's we're one of maybe 5 states that are in really pursuing how to oversee and also offer quality options for students. And so the work you all are doing is phenomenal and really giving a framework of sort of reliability and accountability as a resource to helping districts create great educational options. So I just want to go on record as saying thank you for all the great work that you guys are doing.
Thanks.
Excellent comments. Mr. Eby?
Yes, very complete presentation. I think this is a great start. But here's my question, and also the fact that you're using lessons learned and best practices, I think, is a big plus. But you evaluated 3 authorizers. One had a 1.8, one had a 2.9, and the other one had a 3.5. And kudos to Shelby County Schools for a 3.5. That's outstanding. My question is, how do those scores, and maybe since this is the first time you can't say this, but in the future, how do those scores correlate to the performance of the charter schools within their areas? I mean, that's where the rubber will hit the road. Is there value in what we're doing or not? And I don't know if you can answer that question now or not.
Yeah, that's absolutely the goal here. We've seen that with states such as Ohio that has had this in place for much longer, that they have seen positive outcomes in student scores and student performance as a result of this work. And so we are expecting those same results, and as we continue to move through the different cycles, we will be able to start tracking that as well.
Other questions or comments, Mr. Mullenhour?
I just want to echo Nate's comments. Excellent job. And the fact that you have already thought about what Mr. Eby brought up and are already thinking ahead and mapping towards that is just fantastic. So thank you.
Thank you.
I want to echo those comments as well. I know that when I had a prep call, and Allie, I shared with you at the time that we met, I was incredibly impressed with this evaluation process, how you mentioned rigor, thoroughness, et cetera. It's absolutely that. And I think for the first time doing this, incredibly impressive. So thank you so much for that. And all the things that you thought about along the way and how you're making it better for the authorizers and for them to connect with one another and to hear best practices from each other. In particular, Shelby sharing their stories, their best practices. Extremely well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I believe that's it. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
Okay. Trying to get back on track. Thank you. The next presentation is education funding. Ms. Megan McElroy.
Okay, let's see if I can work this clicker. There we go. All right, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Megan McElroy. I'm the Chief Statewide Support Officer at the Tennessee Department of Education. In that role, I oversee our regional core offices that provide support out to school districts. I also oversee a suite of professional learning and leadership networks for school leaders across the state. I also have the good fortune in my role of engaging with our superintendents quite a bit. I travel out to most of their regional meetings and get to engage with them on what's happening in their districts and how we can better support them. I know most, if not all of you, were part of our subcommittee process related to school funding, which is what I'm here to talk about today. So I want to just acknowledge that some of what I'll share you probably know and lived personally. It may not be new information to you, but I do think it's important to kind of ground us in a common context. So I will try to go through it quickly though and allow you to ask questions, spend more time on the things that you're interested in understanding more deeply. So let me start with just a quick recap of our public engagement process. This started in October with a call from Governor Lee to explore a potential new school funding framework for the state of Tennessee. And I think one of the most critical components of that process for our governor and commissioner was that this was really generated with the public and with stakeholders And so we launched a robust public engagement process that has really helped drive what will ultimately be proposed as the formula. You all know the 18 subcommittees that you participated in, and I want to just say a thank you very much to all of you for the time and the thought and the contributions that you put into that space. It's hugely helpful and critical on such an important topic. So I'm very appreciative of your service in that respect. They just finished their last of 6 meetings last week and submitted final recommendations to the department that will go actually to the steering committee that the commissioner hosted this morning. So we are very active in this space even today. We also held a series at the beginning of this process of local town halls, both on the state side of funding, the local side of funding. We've had Twitter town halls, newsletters, and an email inbox where we captured comment from anyone that wanted to submit. We also, so the first slide was the things that we as a department hosted directly. We've also been engaged in supporting a lot of different opportunities that have occurred across the state. So we had a lot of interest from districts, community organizations to host their own regional town halls and be able to share that feedback back with the department. So we created toolkits and resources to help them do that. We also had more folks who wanted to be involved in our subcommittees than we could have. And so we created an ambassador program that over 1,300 Tennesseans signed up to participate in, which is remarkable. And they essentially have a feedback form and go out and seek feedback from their communities, their stakeholder groups, and provide that back regularly to the department. We're also grateful to have worked with Tara to include some school funding related questions on a Vanderbilt poll that they did recently. Those slides from the results of that poll are on our website. But I think the big takeaway is that we are getting remarkably consistent feedback from that poll that we had been hearing from our engagement as well. So that was encouraging. We've also worked with a series of experts in this space to provide information to our subcommittees and help them through that process. And then finally, some of our additional engagement opportunities here. I won't talk through each one. I know you can see them on the slides, but highlight here on the first couple are robust engagement with our school districts and our superintendents. I personally led a lot of that, went to regional study councils, talked with superintendents about what they want and see as needs for their students. Traveled to 54 districts that are small and rural and maybe didn't have opportunities to get to a town hall or to participate in a subcommittee. Talked with their leadership teams one-on-one about what priorities and needs they see in their communities. And so I think you can see the other engagements here as well. But again, I think want to underscore kind of the consistency in what we're hearing across the state. And in just a moment, I'll kind of share what some of those top line items are that we've proposed in a draft framework. All of the information I just talked through, as you all lived and know well, went to our subcommittees. So you can see here every public comment, every recording of every town hall that we did, all of that went to our subcommittees along with some additional information and context materials that we put together at their request from the department level, went to the subcommittees to help inform their thinking and their recommendations that they developed for their specific topic area, as well as just more broadly recommendations for a potential new formula. That all then goes to the steering committee, which is made up of the leadership of House and Senate Education and Finance committees, and they will work through kind of narrowing to a final set of recommendations. One of the most common questions we get is, why are you doing this right now? So I wanted to address that as we move into what some of the recommendations are currently. First, I just want to underscore that the current formula is 30 plus years old, has not been meaningfully updated in that time. And we have over 15 years of feedback on what needs to be improved with that formula. We've had BEP review committees. We had the Haslam task force several years ago. And we have taken all of that feedback into account as we embark on this new funding formula process now. So we have that wealth of information that's helped drive some of what we're thinking about now. I also want to note that after that 15 years of feedback, it felt to us like time for action, time to actually do something. And I think our current funding landscape in the state of Tennessee has afforded us an opportunity to really consider what that might look like. I will certainly talk about the governor's proposal, the funding. We can get into that as we head into next steps. But the current landscape presented a really unique opportunity to actually move on something we've been talking about as a state for a really long time. I think the last thing I want to note on this slide is that from the governor's perspective, this is not just about more money. It really has to be paired with a well-intentioned strategy, which is where designing a new formula comes into play. That is a critical part of the investment that he is proposing to make. Please feel free to ask questions as we go, by the way.
Mr. Mullenhour.
I would just say you're doing a great job covering a lot of ground, so keep going.
All right, try to catch up some time for you. I want to talk through, we released a draft framework recently. I want to talk through what is in that framework. It is a result of the most common trends and themes that we heard through subcommittees. So we will jump into that. Before we do, want to just note some quick context though. Generally in education, there have been 3 different types of funding models. There's a categorical, this is what the feds use. So you have your Perkins, your IDEA. It has to be used for certain activities within that category as they define it. There's resource-based models. That is what the current BEP is in Tennessee. That is where you essentially fund a resource based on a number of students within a district. So you might get one principal if you have 300 students in a school. That's not the right number, but it's just an example. Or you might generate one special ed position if you have 10 students with disabilities. So it's really funding resources at a system level. And then the third is a student-based formula, which is what we are proposing to move to in Tennessee. And you can see on this slide that 39 states across the country have already made this shift, including some of our neighbors in the Southeast region. So we are a little bit behind kind of the trend on shifting to this type of formula, which is where you really fund based on the individual needs of a student. And this is what that looks like. So there are 4 components to most of these student-based funding models. You have your base. This is what we believe every single student, no matter where they live, no matter who they are, what every single student needs for a basic education. Then you add on your weights. These are multipliers. These address the individual needs of specific students. So in the weight category, we think of the traditional things you might think of, students with disabilities, English learners, but also thinking a little bit outside the box around students being educated in rural communities and things like that. What is the additional costs that it takes to provide those students what they need? Then you move up the pyramid here into direct funding. These would be allocations that are not something for every student. That would be part of the base, and are not necessarily able to be tied based on any kind of predetermined characteristics to a certain student. So you could think about things like summer school. Funding that we provide for summer school would be kind of a direct allocation, and then the district will make decisions about enrollment for students. And then finally, the last piece is outcomes. This is a component of most of these formulas. It looks different state to state. The conversation that's been happening here in Tennessee has primarily been focused on college and career readiness indicators. So we're not really talking about TCAP or state tests in this space. We're talking about programs that will prepare students for what is to come when they leave their K-12 experience. So the intent there is to offer funds to districts who do that well so that they can expand and continue to grow access to those programs. In terms of what we're hearing, so this moves into kind of what we've proposed in our draft framework. First, just kind of overall feedback that has been resounding. Not surprising on the first one, districts should not receive less funding under a new formula than they received previously. It's not not winners and losers situation is not one that anyone wants to be in. And I think the governor's commitment of increased funding in this space that you heard in the State of the State speaks to that. Second is that districts can maintain flexibility for how they use funds. Our current BEP, we call very intentionally a funding plan, not a spending plan. There was a huge desire for that to remain to be true. Third is, can we bring in things that we have to do separate grant applications for outside of the formula into the formula and just make it direct funding? So things like coordinated school health, safety, we do all of those grants separately, but they're state funded, and so we will be looking to pull as much of that in as possible to streamline that process. And then finally, there's been a lot of conversation about the local side of funding, which is really the next phase of this. We haven't dug in as deeply to the local side yet, but definitely county commissioners, we've heard loud and clear, want the local match to be reconsidered as a part of this formula. What should that look like? What should their responsibility be? And then from school districts, we've heard a lot of requests to ensure that maintenance of effort is retained so that the state dollars are not just replacing what they would have received otherwise. This just shows you the kind of the timeline of our framework. I won't talk through it for the sake of time, but it's on our website. I hope most of you have seen it. We released a draft framework. I want to be clear that it did not include dollar amounts. It was not about sort of listing the funding and the exact weights, but really about reflecting back the feedback that we've been hearing through our public engagement process, and then narrowing the list of priorities. And so that went to both the public and subcommittees to be able to react to and provide feedback and start to define some of the policy considerations around how we define certain terms. So let me go through those 4 components briefly and just share some of the components that were in our framework that we've heard a lot of feedback on and are strongly considering for a new funding model. All of the things, well, most of the things on this slide are things we've heard throughout the feedback on the BEP. So I mentioned earlier, we've had these BEP review committees in various forms and fashions over the last 15 years, and educator salaries, RTI funding, counselors, technology, nurses. These are all things that have come up pretty consistently in that feedback, and we are reflecting all of that in the proposal around base funding. I will say that everything named here is on top of what's already in the BEP. Everything that already exists would continue to be funded in the new formula. This would be additional money to support additional resources in these areas. The one I'll note here is district-specific needs. In our feedback from superintendents in particular, we heard a lot of varying needs based on what they have now around school resource officers, principals, APs, CTE. It was not super consistent when you get past the other bullets on this slide in terms of what districts really felt like they needed. So this would be sort of a general funding allocation that they could use to accommodate their needs. So that's the base. Moving into the weights, what we've proposed in the framework are 4 different weights. First being poverty and concentrated poverty. There's been a lot of conversation about this as we've engaged with stakeholders. And the difference between the two being the idea that poverty is individual students in a school, maybe at a lower threshold than, so if you have 5% of your students in poverty in your school versus 95%, there are different needs there, and being able to direct resources to both students in both types of schools. That's what that one refers to. Second is rural. Again, and this is where the subcommittees and steering committee have been working to kind of define some of these pieces. How do we define poverty? How do we define rural? And make sure we've got the right definitions, but knowing that it often costs more to educate kids in rural communities in terms of transportation, services that they might not have access to within the vicinity of their community. So that would provide additional funding for those students. Unique learning needs is some of the things we talked about before. Students with disabilities, English learners, gifted, and dyslexia are the 4 that have risen to the top in terms of priorities. And then finally, charter schools. So there's been a lot of discussion about this one in particular, subcommittees where they have constituents who are interested in this topic. But essentially what this would do is the governor has historically funded a facilities fund for charter schools separately in his budget. And so this would essentially pull that directly into the funding formula. And so that students, it would add additional weights for students in charter schools. And that is because, as you all probably well know, those schools often have to pay rent to their authorizing district for facilities. And so this would kind of level the playing field. The direct funding component, there are three things we've proposed currently in this space: fast-growing districts. So this would be an allocation to districts who are experiencing significant enrollment growth, to be defined as we work through the process. But knowing that we have a lot of business and industry moving into the state, and a lot of our communities are experiencing rapid increases in enrollment, and allowing them to ensure continuity of services for students immediately following that kind of growth. I think you all know in the last special session last year, a bill was, the Learning Loss and Student Acceleration bill was passed that will require fourth graders starting in the 23-24 school year who were below basic on their third grade ELA TCAP to receive tutoring. So this will add funding to districts to be able to support that. And then finally, increased funding for career and technical education. Middle school has been a big topic of conversation in this space, really wanting to make that kind of a 6-year versus 4-year trajectory to really engaging in CTE, career counseling, those types of things. So we will be adding additional funding in this proposal directly to districts for that purpose. And then finally, outcomes. I mentioned earlier, the conversation among stakeholders in Tennessee has really been focused on those post-secondary readiness indicators as well as the outcomes associated with them. So to the statewide dual credit conversation earlier, districts will, in this proposal, only receive funding for actually completion and passage of an exam or, earning an industry certification, whatever that requirement is with that particular indicator. You also see here early literacy. This has been a big topic of conversation. Obviously, it's a huge priority for our state, but the steering committee in particular has had a lot of conversation about early literacy outcomes and how that can play into the formula. I think the biggest thing we're wrestling with right now is how do you meaningfully measure that? It's not as clear as some of the others, and so that's kind of the discussion I'm sure they engaged in earlier today at the steering committee. So that is what we've proposed currently and are currently reconciling feedback from subcommittees working with the steering committee. Let me talk briefly through timelines and next steps, and then happy to answer questions. I did these slides a week ago, and so a lot has happened since then. You all know the state of the state happened, but our subcommittees have wrapped, as I said. We are refining that framework based on the additional feedback. The governor announced $1 billion in new recurring funding for education on Monday in the state of the state that plays into this formula. I will talk about that when we get into kind of our next steps, but that is where we are now. And then I think you can expect within the next several weeks to actually have a bill that will accompany the governor's budget to actually define what this formula will look like. So it will take that framework, reconcile the feedback, and then turn it into an actual formula that will be introduced in the General Assembly. Okay, I guess that was my last slide. In terms of what, would you like me to speak briefly to what was proposed in terms of funding for this, or?
I would say yes, definitely.
So let me see if I can break down that $1 billion that was proposed. I will just say the caveat up front that the governor's budget is a proposal. It is completely up to the General Assembly what they decide to fund, so none of this is guaranteed. But the funds are directly tied to a new formula. So let me break down quickly what that $1 billion entails. And we need to think about it in terms of this coming fiscal year, separately from the fiscal years that will follow. So if you take that billion, let's think specifically about FY23, the upcoming fiscal year. I'm going to put it in two chunks, 250 million and 750 million. The 250 million would roll into the BEP. So current BEP for next school year will be, that 250 million will go into the BEP. That includes the 125 million he talked about for teacher salary increases, as well as standard increases. The rest is kind of standard increases that we add to the BEP every year to accommodate growth, insurance, those kinds of things. So those are kind of, that 250 is kind of the standard increase he's done for the last several years around teacher salaries and other components of the BEP, and that will go into the BEP for this next year. The 750 million is what essentially we would do some one-time funding opportunities with for this upcoming year, and then in future years it will roll into the new formula. So what he's proposed for FY23, to use that funding in a one-time way until we potentially have a new formula to put it into, is what some of the things that he talked about in terms of a $500 million investment for expanding innovative school models in middle and high schools, CTE programming, as well as $200 million for rebuilding schools that are in floodplains. Those are the two big ticket items that he will do one time with that 750. There's a couple other additional grants that will be funded as well. So then that will be what will happen next year should a formula pass through the new formula pass through the General Assembly. In future years, that entire $1 billion, the 250 that I talked about at the beginning, and the 750 will be built into this formula and will fund the various additional components that I talked about on the prior slides. So that is where we are. As I said, in a few weeks, you can expect to see a bill, and that will provide a lot more information about what's being proposed. That's all I have. Happy to answer any questions.
You did that with rapid speed.
I'm trying.
You did a great job there. Thank you. Questions, comments? Yes, Mr. Darnell.
First, I would like to give a shout out to this whole process. Again, most of us were involved, and I feel like it was a very thorough process that was open to anyone who wanted to share. I've been very impressed by that. And Steve Starnes was our subcommittee leader, and Janice Fox from CORE. They just did a great job of keeping us informed. We got all of the information early so that we could review that. I felt like the time that we put into each hour was very deliberative, and I just can't say enough good about that whole process. And then when I look at this kind of draft that's come out, these are the things that we all were there. So it was good to see that all the subcommittees are seeing the same things, and ultimately what is best for kids. And how can we help teachers? How can we help systems, be productive? The one thing that I guess I still have questions about and kind of how this is going to work, and I know it's still evolving, so is the outcome funding. So when I look at these, kind of these indicators, I know that our system in Hamlin County and many in the first district really focus on the CTE completers and the work-based learning and have been very successful in that, okay? So let's do a scenario of we have really, really high numbers in that, and what would that look like as far as the outcome funding? I don't know. I don't know where to go from that. What can you tell me about what it would look like? What would the money be used for that the systems would be given?
Yep. So it would essentially be a per student additional allocation. Students from the prior year, right, that the district would then receive the following year. I think it's probably some of the conversations we have with districts is helping them think about that as a little bit less of a predictable pot. And so they need to be really thoughtful about what they do with it. Those funds would stay with the district even if a student leaves. We've had that question come up from districts. But really it's about helping them grow and expand those offerings, get more students enrolled in those programs, and particularly with a focus on students who are maybe not traditionally served in those pathways. So again, though, it is still a funding plan, and so districts will have a lot of flexibility in terms of how they want to use those funds.
So with this, it might be wise not to necessarily fund positions, but it might be the resources and development of
That's
things.
exactly right.
Because the next year, if you have a rough patch, then you might not necessarily be guaranteed.
Yep, or as you get a different crop of kids who have interests in different things and maybe don't want to, choose different opportunities. So yes, that's a fair way to think about it.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Mullenhour, then you. Then
I would emphasize again, just great job. You covered a lot of ground very quickly, and this is obviously a hot topic. I would agree with Mr. Donnell. It was a well-constructed process. You guys have run it well. Is it perfect? I'm sure it's not, but you guys have done a great job. When I think about this, the first thing that comes to mind is a saying from a fellow named Charlie Munger, and he says, "Show me the incentive, and I will show you the outcome." And as I think about the way that this framework has been presented, it would seem that the base weights and direct funding elements are essentially a safety net to make sure that kids aren't falling through the cracks. But at the same time, it's saying, hey, let's create a stretch goal. Let's create an incentive so that, as Mr. Munger says, we can help drive the outcomes. My question is this. Will the outcomes be measured on a relative basis, or will they be measured on a trajectory basis? In other words, we don't want to penalize one school system because they just naturally are doing better than another, even if they haven't actually changed anything? Or can we more meticulously make sure that the individual school system itself, or district, or even individual school is being incentivized and rewarded to incrementally improve? How do you envision we will be able to reward trajectory as opposed to just, this one's better than this one over here, relative?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so as I said, it is based on individual students and the completing, passing a statewide dual credit course, for example, passing an AP exam, et cetera, earning an industry certification. So even an increase of 5 students, right, in a program like that for a district generates additional funding. So in that way, there is a little bit of like incremental progress there. It's not relative, and it's not an all or nothing. I think the other thing I would say is that part of what we're thinking about with that $500 million that I talked about for every middle and high school across the state that the governor has proposed in one-time funding would help level the playing field for districts and allow folks who maybe don't offer as many of these programs to use funding now to begin to prepare, knowing that this will generate additional resources in the future. You would imagine that districts might think differently about what they offer and the scope of what they offer for students, and those resources would help them get there.
And just to clarify, the current data collection would support the determination of these outcomes, these incentives, or is there additional data collection processes or procedures that would need to be put into place?
We collect that data now. A lot of those indicators are part of our accountability system as well. We have a Ready Graduate indicator that looks at completion and of those, a lot of those opportunities. I can't speak to entirely whether it's all of that is currently collected. There may be, especially around pass rates and things like that, we may need to seek additional data either from the vendors themselves or from districts, but I couldn't speak to that with certainty. But we do collect a lot of it already.
I have a question. Has there been any discussion about sort of we'll know this formula has been effective if, in the sense of, 2 years down the line, there's been so much amazing work, and I'll echo so much amazing work and thoroughness to get to this point. What are we going to look for to be able to grade ourselves against to say, yeah, this is more effective than what we did have, and also it's really appropriately funding the needs of students, and by the needs of students, therefore the school district and those things?
I think the primary thing we look at is our outcomes for students. Are we seeing increases in performance for students with disabilities, English learners? Are we seeing more kids leaving high school with those, some of the tools and certifications that might benefit them as they progress into post-secondary or careers? So certainly the student outcomes piece is important. I do think one thing I'll note sort of related to that is that I think one thing this potential new formula provides is a lot more transparency and accountability around how districts and schools are using funding to serve students. It will be much more clear, and the public reporting for this will be very transparent. It is now required by the feds that we report on spending at the school level, which is not something we've previously done, and this formula will make that much easier to do and much more clear in terms of this school generated this number of dollars, you know, based on these things, and how were they actually spent and what was the correlated outcome to that. So I think that will also help in that space as well.
He just
Mr.
asked my question, but I want to ask it in a slightly different way. First, let me also echo the process that we've gone through. It's just been outstanding. I don't think there's a individual in the state of Tennessee that can't say that they didn't have the opportunity to provide input. And kudos to the department and to the commissioner and to the legislature and everybody who worked on this. This has been a great process. My question, and I think you just answered it, was we all agree the BEP has been there for 30 years and needs to look at, you know, what can we do to make it better? You said there were 39 states that have moved to this student-based funding. What can we say to those people who still say we need to stay with the BEP? And I think what I just heard you say is that this new process provides more transparency into the outcomes and the process. Is that how you would answer that?
That is absolutely right. That I think this is a much more, first of all, it's funding students versus systems, and that feels hugely important, particularly given the needs that we're seeing in students as a result of the last several years. So really, it attends more to their needs versus a resource-based that sort of builds systems around them. And as you said, provides a lot more transparency for parents and other stakeholders around what we are investing in their child specifically and what they should expect from their local school.
Then I believe that you indicated, or at least it came out through the discussions in the subcommittees, that this year, this first year, obviously the funding is put aside, the $1 billion as you laid it out, and in the future, the next year, then we would move into the new formula. I know there's been a lot of pushback and questions from school districts regarding that local piece, the local match, and that strong desire to know where that's going to land, what that's going to look like. And I know there's been a debate about how that could be approached. Do you have an update on where the state stands with regard to what you're thinking, how you will proceed with that?
Yeah, barring any, so just to recap, there has been a lot of discussion about whether we move forward with the local, fleshing out the local match now while we're doing the state formula, or just in follow-up to the state formula, or whether we take the next year, right, prior to the formula going into effect, should it pass through the General Assembly, prior to that formula going into effect, and take more time to flesh that out. Barring anything different that might have been said or decided in the steering committee meeting this morning, which I haven't seen yet, the last conversation that I heard about this is that the consensus seems to be to move forward sooner than later. And so we will, at this point in time, plan to move forward with the local match in short order following the state.
Thank you. Mr. Morrow.
One more question. Does this include removing disincentives for early graduation? I know the original BEP, not so much. 2.0 was kind of year at a time. And I just wanted to check in to see how, we want students to accelerate, and the ERIC Commission's coming out with some ideas and has ideas on how to do that, and just want to make sure that I don't want to disincentivize students graduating when they're ready. So is that in this?
I have not heard conversation about that. So what I would say is that I probably wouldn't be able to speak really specifically until there is a draft bill. Okay. That hasn't come up in recommendations or feedback. I'm not aware that there's anything that would make it different than it is now, but I wouldn't want to say
that was a major conversation in our subcommittee, is that because what happens is if a student graduates early, which we would like for them to do, then the dollars come away from the district.
Right.
And so what was told about in our discussion, our subcommittee was, there's no incentive for the districts to push those students forward because they lose money. And so we need to take that penalty away.
Right, that's what I'm getting to.
Yeah, I made a note to follow up on that because it's not something I personally know much about,
Okay.
but I will certainly see if there's any additional information that we can share back with you all on that topic.
Yeah, thank you, just because it goes right into this idea of,
Yep.
looking at new and inventive ways and wanting to get kids where they need to go as they need to go there.
Yeah,
And want to make
absolutely.
that something that we incentivize, not just unintentionally disincentivize.
That's right, absolutely. Yep, understood.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Mr. Molinaro.
Thank you. Has your team considered how creating incentives might create, as Mr. Morrow has said, disincentives for otherwise good behavior? For example, where you might have two different schools that are, a student could go to one or the other for various reasons, and one school really wants that student because of the outcomes measure. Does it create a situation where you have you create competition that just needs to be understood and monitored a certain way so that we don't send students to the wrong school for the wrong reasons?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I think something we always have to consider in terms of what adverse incentives might we be creating without realizing it with the best laid plans. And so I think that's certainly something that we will look at as we start to actually flesh out the language and make sure that we've got safeguards in place and that we're not inadvertently, incentivizing something that isn't in the best interest of students.
Thank you. Excellent job today.
Thank you. Thank you all for the feedback on the process as well. Very much appreciated.
And thank you so much for being here today and presenting this and distilling it for everyone. Even though we've been serving on subcommittees, I think bringing it all together the way that you did has been very effective. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The next agenda item is historical trends in student retention data. Dr. Susan K. Patrick and Caitlin Elgart.
Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Patrick. I just want to recognize Caitlin, who will be behind me. I'm just going to present today, but I want to recognize her efforts. She's a third-year PhD student at Vanderbilt who's done all the data analysis for the data that we'll be talking about today. All righty. Oh, wrong way. Okay, great. I'm going to set the scene. I know we have limited time, and so there's lots that we could talk about on this topic of early grade student retention, which we're defining as student retention in kindergarten, first, second, and third grade. There's lots we could talk about. I know we have limited time, so I'm going to try to hit kind of most important points of what we found in our analysis so far. I'm presenting on behalf of the Tennessee Education Research Alliance, which you may be familiar with already, but is a research practice partnership between the Tennessee Department of Ed and Vanderbilt. So just to set the scene, I know this is something you all have been thinking about because there's been a lot of action in terms of policy and law changes, especially around third grade promotion and retention. So just as a few reminders of what this has looked like over the last 10, 12 years in terms of what's been going on statewide. So in 2011, the Tennessee legislature passed a third grade retention law, which indicated that third grade students should be retained if they do not show proficiency in reading at the end of third grade, either through standardized test results or grades. This also indicated that districts could provide research-based interventions for those students in lieu of retention. And importantly, it also excluded students with IEPs. This law was slightly updated in 2012, but the main components of the law stayed the same. As you all are very aware, you updated your own promotion and retention policies, which added a little bit more details and specifics about how to make those decisions about which students should be promoted or retained. A couple of things just to point out, because they're going to come back in the later analysis, is that one of the things that was in that updated promotion and retention policy is that retention decisions should not be based solely on having an IEP, being an English learner, or maturity. And then finally, as you may remember, last year during the special session, there was a new third grade retention law that was passed by the legislature. This updated the prior law, but actually put a lot more kind of specifics in the law about what needed to happen with third graders who are not proficient based on their standardized testing results, and indicated very specific interventions that those students should have. And also importantly, did put in a couple of additional exceptions for students who had been previously retained or English learners. Again, this will come up again in the analysis, so just want to point it out.
And as we move forward, we will be working on rulemaking related to this topic later this spring. So that's why we particularly wanted this presentation for our board members now, so you can have this context moving forward this year.
Great. Thanks, Amy. And so just to ground this very briefly in the prior research on third grade retention, as well as early grades retention more broadly. So there are a lot of challenges when it comes to researching retention because most states and the National Department of Education do not actually look at this at the student level. So there's no national data that exists to know kind of how many students every year are retained. So there are individual states that publish those results, but it's actually really hard to track. In general, the research on retention would suggest that retaining students has negative or null effects on those students' outcomes. However, a lot of more recent research with some of the kind of high-profile third grade retention policies, such as Florida, Chicago, other places that have put these in place in the last 2 decades, would suggest that it's not universally the case that retention has negative outcomes, and that it seems to matter when students are retained, with the conventional wisdom being that earlier retention tends to have better outcomes than later retention, and that the interventions that go along with retention or might happen in lieu of retention are actually quite important. And so it could be that the act of retaining a student, just saying you're going to do second grade again, that policy decision may not have positive outcomes. But if that's going alongside of something like tutoring, summer school, additional support for that student, that may influence kind of the effect of retention for the students. All right, so just a little bit about this project. It's been a pleasure to work with Amy and the State Board staff and kind of refining what this was going to look like to hopefully inform your own decision-making about promotion and retention policies. Today, we're going to focus on these first 2 research questions that are kind of defining the analysis, which are really understanding who, looking statewide, who in the state is being retained. How have retention rates changed over time? How do they vary across schools and districts? And do we see differences in patterns of student retention based on certain student, school, and district characteristics? And then finally, because we know there's been a lot of law and policy changes, have those varied across time after you see a law change or a policy change? Caitlin and I will be working throughout the spring answering these 3rd and 4th questions, and so we'd particularly love your feedback and thoughts about what are things you would really like to know and would help inform your own policy making around this topic. So just a little bit about kind of how we've done this analysis, because it's important for kind of understanding the patterns that I'll be showing you in just a second. So we're using the statewide student data system, EIS, and we're looking across 12 years of data, starting with the 2009-2010 school year. So that was before the first third grade retention law went into effect. Again, we're looking at the early grades, kindergarten, first, second, and third. And we're defining retention as a student who, based on their administrative records in the system, spent 2 full years in the same grade. So we're going to start off with just looking at statewide trends. How does Tennessee compare to national trends or other states? And then what does it look like overall across time in the state? So this is very hard to see, but I will try to kind of walk you through it. So this is the most recent national and state comparisons of retention rates. This is from the 2008-2009 year. So I think this speaks to kind of this data challenge that this is the most recent information we can share. But what this is trying to indicate is that the national average is there in that black bar. You can see Tennessee is now highlighted in red. And so the point being here is that as of 2008-2009, Tennessee's retention rates, this is showing first grade, were very in line with the national average. And so kind of what our patterns look like, we're looking like, this is what a lot of states are doing, but there's a huge amount of variation, as you can see across all the bars in this graph. There are states that have much lower retention rates and states that have much higher retention rates. This is the same graphic, but showing third grade retention rates. Again, this is showing it before the policy change, so before the law went into effect. And as of that time, Tennessee had lower third grade retention rates than the national average, but these numbers are all very low. If you actually look at the y-axis here, the states with the highest percent were still in the single digits. So the last thing we did is that the National Center for Education Statistics, which is out of the U.S. Department of Education, does publish K-8 estimated retention rates. And so we can compare what we see in the Tennessee data with what they publish nationally. And so what you can see is two things, one of which is a trend you'll see in all of the analysis we're going to look at today, is that Tennessee's retention rates are trending down, and the national rates are a little bit more stable, and then Tennessee's are a little bit lower than the national average, but look fairly similar to the national average. Okay. So the rest of the slides are all going to look at Tennessee-specific data. What do we know across the state about who's being retained? And so this first slide is actually just showing what does retention look like over time, by grade, by year. And so the way to read all of the graphs that I'm going to show you today is that this is showing that in the 2010 school year, so the 2009 to 2010 school year, 5% of kindergarten students were retained for the following year. And you can read that across the graph to see how that's trended down a little bit over time. And then you can see, and this is aligned with national trends, that as students progress through the early grades, retention rates drop. So you tend to see this nationally, you see this here. And so a couple of things to point out here. As you can see, third grade retention rates across this entire 12-year span have been quite low. And we don't see a lot of evidence that after the law change, there was big differences in at least the number of kids getting retained in third grade. And then I've also put in the policy change here. Again, not many years of data to look at, but we can see there hasn't been dramatic differences in the percentage of students being retained amid either the law or policy change. So to give you a sense of like what numbers are we talking about here? If we look at, for example, the year 2014, if you add up all these percentages together, so across the state in 2014, there were about 300,000 kindergarten through third grade students. Of those, about 9,000 of those students were retained. So to give you a sense of scale. We also wanted to understand, this probably actually looks quite different. I mean, many people who have been in schools and have kind of thought about what kind of decisions might go into a student being retained or not, that there might be a lot of reasons why we would expect that these statewide averages might not reflect what's happening for individual groups of students or individual schools or districts. So we did want to look in a little more detail to understand those differences. This is just a sense of the different ways that we've analyzed the data. I'm not going to show all of them to you today. I'm going to try to highlight ones that I think probably are most of interest given kind of the way the policy is written and how you all have thought about promotion and retention in the past. And so one I'll start with, which is personally of interest to me because I have a kindergartner who has an August birthday, is looking at age. So a lot of people kind of conventional wisdom about retention is that there might be something that's happening around maturity and how people are doing maturity-wise. And so we do look at how retention rates vary based on age. And so we do this for all of the grades, but I'm just going to show it for kindergarten and third grade. Kindergarten and first grade, the patterns look very similar. So all we're doing in the data is we're looking at kindergartners who are relatively old for their grade. They're the oldest kids in the class. And then kindergartners who are relatively young for their grade. They're the youngest kids in the class. And you do see really big differences in the rates of retention, depending on whether students are in one of those two groups, with the kids who are relatively younger, in some cases more than 10 times likely to be retained than the kids in their class who are relatively older. We still see the same difference in third grade, but the difference is much smaller, where kids who are relatively younger in third grade are more likely to be retained, but overall the retention rates are just much lower in third grade than they are in kindergarten.
When you say retain, you mean they went to kindergarten the first year and they didn't, as opposed to the parent deciding that they weren't going to start their child in kindergarten until they became 6 or something like that?
It's a great question. So we can't see parental decisions in the data, right? We don't know if a kid started late or not. It is a good point that probably some of the kids in this highest age bracket are kids who were redshirted or whose parents decided, we're going to wait a year. We're not going to start kindergarten yet. And we don't know that for sure. But we do have birthdays, so that is something we could do a little bit more analysis of. Yeah.
So the ones, make sure I'm just here, so the ones who started younger,
Yep.
More likely to be retained.
Much more likely.
So if you put your kiddo in, just turned 5 versus turning 6 at the
Yep.
August birthday, the younger, the higher likelihood.
That's right. Exactly
Is
right.
that, you may be getting to this, is that same male and female? Because there's also sort of that, oh, girl, you know, I mean.
Sure, yes. I think that's in fact the next slide.
Oh.
So great work. So
tracking with
in
you.
Tennessee, just like nationally, boys are more likely to be retained than girls, although the differences in Tennessee are actually smaller than nationally. But I think you're right to think that there are these things that people think about maturity, and those may be playing out here in terms of these differences.
Was that, this is probably research, is that due to bias, or is that rooted in something beyond, I think girls are more mature than boys at that age?
It's a great question. I can't answer that. This data can't answer
Okay,
that.
that's why I didn't know if that
But,
was in it.
yeah.
Okay.
But I think you're right, that like better understanding how this decision is made is important.
Okay.
And that's not totally clear.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll stop interrupting you.
So a couple more, and I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly because I know we have limited time. We did break this down based on student, racial, ethnic categories as well. You do see some differences, although they are not large differences. A couple of things to point out here is that Asian students always have the lowest retention rates. That's very consistent. The rest of the racial differences are not very consistent over time. Although one thing I will note is that Hispanic students, their retention rates have been dropping pretty consistently. And we're going to get to it in a couple slides, a slide about English learners, which might be partially driving this difference for Hispanic students. And then another thing that probably won't be surprising given what we know about how schools operate is that we do see differences in retention rates based on whether students are identified in the state data system as being economically disadvantaged. So in earlier years, that means eligible for free and reduced price lunch. In later years, that means identified as economically disadvantaged by Tennessee's definition. But you still see this difference in retention where economically disadvantaged students are more likely to be retained. That's consistently true. And then I mentioned a couple slides ago that we also looked at this based on students who are identified as English learners. And this is where there's actually been a lot of change over time. This could potentially be because of policy shifts and changes that specifically call out English learners. But we do see a pretty consistent drop in the retention of English learners over time. One thing that's also important to note here, and as you all know, the demographics of Tennessee have been changing, and so this population of students has also grown a lot in size over this time period. And then finally, another student group that is called out in the policy, and so I think it's important to understand, is the difference in retention rates for students with disabilities. This is using the state data of who's identified as having a disability. And we see across the data pretty consistent differences where students with disabilities are about twice as likely to be retained across all years of data. This varies a lot by disability type, and so there is some additional analysis at the end of the slides, if you're interested, that breaks down what the retention rates look like depending on which disability type students are identified with. And then finally, we looked across a lot of different school and district characteristics. This is the one that we thought would be of most interest, is looking at how retention rates vary between traditional public schools and charter schools. Across the data for most years, although not all, charter schools tend to have slightly higher retention rates. They're not dramatically different. But as you all know, charter school enrollment has increased a lot over this time. And so the number of students, especially elementary students who are enrolled in charter schools, has more than increased by more than tenfold over this time. But you still see this pattern where charters tend to retain at slightly higher rates than traditional public schools. All right, and then this is the last kind of looking at this variation question. One of the things of interest here is that districts and schools are given a lot of discretion. They can make a lot of their own decisions about how they're going to promote and retain students. And so we wanted to look at what does this look like across the state at the district level. So the way this graphic works is every single bar is an individual school district across the state. And so this is showing kindergarten retention rates for each district. I'm going to show it for 2010 and again for 2019. And so you can see if you look at the y-axis, this is going from 0% to 25%. So there's actually quite a lot of variation where some districts are retaining almost no kindergarten students. Some districts are retaining quite a lot of kindergarten students. So back in 2010, the average kindergarten rate at the district level, so the number of students in that district who are retained in kindergarten, the average was about 6%. But you do have a good number of districts, about 23 districts in this case, who had higher than 10% retention rates. So they're retaining a lot more students than other districts across the state. If we look at the same picture for 2019, it looks somewhat similar, although the numbers are lower. So there are more districts that have relatively lower retention rates. So went from 12 districts in 2010 that were retaining under 2% of kindergartners to 30 districts in 2019. Yeah.
I'm not asking to share, but do we know what those districts are?
Yes.
Okay, we know who those districts are and
Yes.
why they did what they did?
No, not to the last
No,
question.
they are, but.
Yes.
Okay.
So
Yes,
in the
no,
data,
they are. No, they don't. Okay.
Yeah. In the data, we can see the individual districts, but we can't get an insight into why we see these changes. It's a great point. And so I did the same thing looking at third grade retention rates. So looking at the district level, what percentage of third graders are being retained in each individual district. Did this for 2010, which is right before the law change, and then in 2019. So importantly, there's a lot of districts across the state. So in 2010, there were 43 districts that didn't retain any third graders at all. The average district retention rate for third grade was a little under 1%. And there are a handful of districts who are retaining relatively more third graders, but it's still a really low percentage. And this looks pretty unchanged in 2019. There are still 43 districts that didn't retain any third grade students. They're not exactly the same districts, but there are about 25 districts that were zeros across the board. But there are plenty of districts across the state who aren't retaining any students at all in third grade. But the other numbers actually look pretty similar. So there hasn't been a whole lot of movement in these kind of district patterns of third grade retention. Okay, and this is the final set of slides. So I wanted to specifically kind of zoom in to third graders who are not proficient in reading. This makes sense given the focus of the law and of thinking about the policies surrounding the third grade retention law. So just to set the stage, I think this is something you've all seen before. This is just showing, based on the data that we have, the percentage of third graders who are not proficient in reading, according to first the TCAP and now the 10 Ready end-of-year assessment. So that's just showing the percentage of third graders and then the pure number of third graders who are in this category. So clearly this is a lot of students. For the last 12 years, this has been more than half of all third graders. This is important to remember because we just saw those retention rates that were very low. So I think an important question is, what's happening to students, in this case, the other 63% of students who are third graders who are not proficient in reading. And so that's kind of one of the things that we're interested in, kind of the additional follow-up that we'll be doing with this analysis. But just to give you a little bit of a sense of what do we see historically for this subgroup of students who are not proficient in reading. One thing to note is that if you are a third grade student who is proficient in reading, there's almost no chance you're going to be retained. The retention rates are, hovering right above zero. They're not zero, but they're very close. But you can see that the retention rates for students in this category of not proficient are also very low. And so part of the question is, what are districts doing to help support these students if they're not being retained? And so this is just kind of giving you a sense of what that looks like. I will note that after the policy change, you do see a slight increase in retention rates. But presumably districts may be doing some different things, whether it's actually retaining more kids or putting in place other interventions to support those students. You can also see here the policy change from the state board, although there's only 1 year of data to really look at here, but we don't see a lot of change over the last few years when it comes to these rates. And then just to give you a sense of the numbers we're talking about, you may remember from before that in 2014, there were about 9,000 kindergarten through third grade students who were retained. In that same year, we're talking about 800 third graders. And so if you break it down in this way, about 720 of those were students who are not proficient in reading, and then the remaining were students in that category of proficient in reading. And then finally, the last thing that we looked at is when we look at third grade retention, do we see those same patterns of like certain students are more likely to be retained than others? And so what this is going to do, it's going to break down for some certain subgroups of students, what percentage of those students were retained before they got to third grade, and for students who were retained then in third grade. This is only looking at students who were not proficient as of the end of third grade based on their either TCAP or 10 ready scores. What I'm doing in the description is I'm actually showing you how many students that is over the years of data. So in this top bar, this is all of the third graders who have not been proficient in reading over those 8 years of data that I showed at the beginning of this section. And so about 12% of those students were retained before they got to third grade. And only about 1% of those students were retained once they were in third grade. But this really varies based on who students are. And so, we saw earlier that boys are more likely to be retained, economically disadvantaged students are more likely to be retained, and students with disabilities are more likely to be retained. So this is just showing how this kind of, once you start adding this up, because we obviously have students who are in multiple of those categories at once, what do retention rates look like for students in those different groupings? So this is showing that over 25% of students who are economically disadvantaged and who are identified as having a disability have been retained before they've gotten to third grade. So their third grade retention rates actually look very similar. They're very similar across the board, but it's that being retained before you get to third grade that actually looks quite different. This is relevant because of the ways that kind of policy and law might think about who is influenced by the third grade retention and promotion laws. And then just to give you a comparison here, so this is comparing against students who are not economically disadvantaged and who are not identified as having a disability. And you can see the difference here depending on kind of which groups students belong to. All right, this is the last slide. Just want to briefly summarize our results so far and talk a little bit about our analysis plans. So to kind of summarize the patterns, retention rates are mostly decreasing over time, although that's more in kindergarten and first grade. Third grade retention rates in Tennessee have held fairly steady, but they are quite low, as you saw throughout the presentation. K-3 retention rates are highest for students with disabilities, students who are relatively younger in their grade, boys, and economically disadvantaged students. They're lower for English learners. Third grade retention rates are much higher for students who perform below proficient, but they're still quite low. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. One of the things we cannot see in this data is whether students maybe went to summer school, or maybe they had a tutor, or maybe they were getting additional support from a reading coach in their school, right? That is not systematically collected. So we don't know what happens to those kids who are in that category of below proficient but promoted. But that's kind of an important question. So moving forward, we have kind of two main things that we're going to be looking at in the remaining parts of the analysis. So we do want to examine the effects of the retention policy changes. So do you actually see differences after the policy change for third graders who are not proficient in reading? And then let's look at the outcomes for retained students. So let's just look descriptively at if you're retained, what does it look like in the next year, or in some cases 3 or 4 years later when it comes to things like your reading achievement. Maybe we have enough years of data, we can look now at how are you doing in terms of your high school progression, attendance, discipline, or disability identification. So really look forward to your questions, but also feedback if there are additional things that you would like us to examine.
Thank you, Mr. Eby.
Yes, thank you. And I know we got to be out of here in about 10 minutes, but I've got a question. I mean, this is great information. It opens up all kinds of questions of how you use the data, et cetera. I mean, it really does. And I'd like to maybe spend some more individual time to understand better. But just one question. You talked about earlier the negative effect of retention, looking at those the students that are retained. Do you compare that to the effect of the non-retained students who should have been retained what their outcomes were versus the outcomes of the, is that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so there's kind of two different approaches to doing this. One is doing exactly what you're describing, where you try to use the data to find comparable students. And we can see that student A and student B on paper look very similar, and student A was retained and student B wasn't. And then follow them over time to see what happens. The challenge of that approach is that, our data, while it covers a lot, doesn't cover everything, right? And there's a bunch of things in there that you might imagine would affect why student A was retained and why student B wasn't retained. And so it can be hard to then be able to compare them and see what happens. There are research studies that will have other methods depending on the policy. And so Florida is kind of the most famous of all the third grade retention laws. They had a very strict cutoff, where it's like if you got a certain score on the FCAT, which is their reading assessment, if you were below that cutoff, you were retained. If you were above, you were promoted. And so they would compare the students right on the edge of that cutoff. And that's a really it's a nice way to be able to make that comparison and think these students should be very similar to one another. And so that's where it's, can be hard to figure out what's the right approach to study that question.
The questions, Mr. Morrow? Yes, thank you.
Can we get a list of the districts that were at the two ends of that curve?
Yes, I think
Okay.
so. Yeah,
Awesome.
Indiana can.
Thank you.
I know we are short on time, but I do want to thank you so much for the presentation today. I think there are several of us that would certainly want to circle back and ask more questions, but we are out of time because we do have two more presenters, and we have to leave the building shortly thereafter. So thank you so much. We didn't really want to rush you. Thank you for being here and taking the time to share the trends with us.
Yes, thanks so much.
Susan will be in touch about study committees, future workshops, future reports, all that great stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all.
Thank you. Next is licensure actions, Ms. Candace Carter and Alex Anderson.
Madam Chair, board members, good afternoon. Before you tomorrow are 9 educator licensure discipline matters. At this time, if you have any questions on those, we're happy to take them. And if you do intend to pull any for discussion tomorrow, please let us know.
Are there any questions? That was easy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Ms. Allie Gaffey on our State Board Master Plan.
Hello again, Allie Gaffey, Director of Engagement and Accountability for the State Board, talking to you about our master plan. We are halfway through the year and wanted to do just a quick report out on where we are in our progress. I will also note that, as you know, I have scheduled with each of you one-on-one meetings to get specific feedback on how this year's plan has been, as well as ideas for next year's plan, so we can continue to have this conversation during that time or answer any additional questions that you may have. So about the master plan, just briefly, the requirement to develop and to maintain a master plan for K-12 education comes from Tennessee Code Annotated 491302. And from here, we've set goals in 5-year increments with smaller annual priorities. And our master plan is updated annually each July and maintains a focus on efforts within the state board's purview. So throughout the slides, you'll see there are check marks. There's one X, and there are several that just have a little timestamp to demonstrate either we have completed that action step for the year, we are in progress, and the X represents one that we are planning to move into next year due to some data issues that we came across. So rather than going through each of these, you have the slides in front of you, and I know we're in a time crunch. So please review those. Happy to answer any questions either right now or in our one-on-one conversations. We just wanted to provide you with an understanding of what slides you have in front of you.
Are there any questions? Yes, Mr. Eby.
Not a question, just a comment, is that as I went back through this and looked at the action steps that we put, we put a lot on you guys. I mean, it's pretty amazing what you're doing with this short staff that you're doing and making, I mean, every one of these things are important, but you guys are doing an outstanding job in pushing through this.
Thank you. You do also have, of course, access to the master plan tracker that I introduced to you all in November. And so details about every single one of these action steps is included in there if you want to dig in further.
Which is an excellent tool, so thank you for producing that, and I do want to echo his comments. Any other comments? Okay, thank you very much.
Great,
Great
thank
work.
you.
Final discussion, any other comments from board members before we adjourn? I'm sorry?
Are you going to be on WebEx?
Oh, yes, yes. Yes, Mr. Eby.
Yeah, this is a totally different issue. I just let the board know that I had a conversation. I got contacted by TASSER, who is doing a study on the Tom Cronin Act and physical education in the elementary schools. And very interesting discussion that we had. It brings to me the question, you know, we last year we set the rule on that and gave a waiver for non-phys ed teachers for a year, but that was the only waiver we got on Tom Cronin. One thing that I would like at some point in time is to get an assessment on how the schools, the districts, are following the Tom Cronin Act, because I'm hearing different things on that. So I would like to get some feedback on that. But a very good, they were tasked by the legislature to do this assessment, and they're going to have their report out. I think they have to have a draft out by the end of this calendar year and report by March of next year. That sort of compares how these districts are doing, but just thought I'd pass that on.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Any other comments? I know the board members know this. We did have to make a change to meeting in person tomorrow to meeting via WebEx because of the inclement weather. I hope it's not a hardship for anyone, but I think it's better for everyone to stay safe at home or in your office as opposed to driving from one end of the state or even within the city. So I do look forward to seeing board members online tomorrow. And I just want to say, without any other comments, I'm going to say that the purposes of the Committee of the Whole have been fulfilled. Therefore, I declare that we are adjourned. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon.